The history of the Arameans cannot be approached in isolation from the wider stage of the ancient Near East, because long before they appeared in historical records, the lands they would come to inhabit were already layered with millennia of human settlement, the rise and fall of city-states, and the gradual weaving together of cultural traditions. The Fertile Crescent, stretching from the river valleys of Mesopotamia across the Levantine corridor and into the lands bordering the Mediterranean, had already witnessed enormous demographic changes and technological transformations by the second millennium before our era. Agricultural systems had long since been established along the Euphrates and the Orontes, while pastoral groups roamed the dry steppes that formed the transitional zone between fertile plains and arid deserts. This background provides the essential framework for understanding how the Arameans emerged and why their influence became so deeply imprinted upon the region's later history. In the early 3rd millennium, the Sumerians of southern Mesopotamia, the Akkadians who absorbed and spread Semitic languages across the region, and the Amorites who had already moved in waves into both Mesopotamia and the Levant, had created a precedent for how migratory populations could gradually establish political authority in settled zones. The Amorites in particular provide a parallel that would later help historians and archaeologists interpret the Aramean story, because they too began as semi-nomadic tribal confederations, only to become rulers of great cities like Babylon. The Fertile Crescent was not a static landscape. It was a dynamic frontier where settled agrarian societies and mobile pastoralists continually interacted. The balance between those who cultivated fields and those who herded flocks produced both conflict and integration, and it was within this ecological and cultural dynamic that the Arameans eventually carved out their identity. The environmental setting is crucial. The Euphrates River, winding from the mountains of Anatolia down through Syria and into Mesopotamia, created a natural corridor along which people, goods, and ideas travelled for thousands of years. Seasonal flooding replenished the soils in the valleys, while the adjoining steppes provided pasture land for sheep, goats, and camels. These lands did not belong exclusively to any single group. Farmers along the riverbanks cultivated cereals and legumes, while nomads moved across the margins, sometimes peacefully exchanging products like wool, meat, and hides for grain, sometimes raiding when resources were scarce or when political conditions allowed. This ecological duality of river valley and steppe formed the backdrop to the social patterns in which the Arameans, a people who began in nomadic and tribal lifeways, could flourish. Archaeological layers from cities like Mari on the middle Euphrates show how urban centres had already mastered irrigation, storage and administration by the 18th century BCE. At Mari, clay tablets record a world where long-distance trade connected the Euphrates Valley with Anatolia, Iran, and the Levantine coast. Caravans carried metals, textiles, and luxury goods, and along with them moved ideas, religious practices, and languages. Into this already complex network of cities and trade routes, pastoralist groups repeatedly entered the record as either allies, mercenaries, or threats. One of the most telling aspects of these texts is their frequent mention of tribal movements on the fringes of the Euphrates Valley. The city dwellers saw them both as a danger to settled stability and as a source of manpower animals. The Arameans, centuries later, would be described in similar terms by the Assyrians and Babylonians, which shows that the cultural template for interaction between sedentary states and mobile tribes was well established. The Levant to the west was equally important in this context. The coastal plains of Phoenicia supported prosperous maritime towns like Byblos and Ugarit, while inland valleys connected the Mediterranean with the great river systems. The terrain was more fragmented than the open plains of Mesopotamia, and this geography favoured smaller kingdoms and city-states rather than vast territorial empires. The combination of fertile valleys, strategic trade routes, and defensible highlands made Syria and the Levant a mosaic of peoples and polities, a patchwork into which the Arameans would later insert themselves. The cultural mixture was already intense, with Canaanite traditions shaping religion. with Egyptian influence extending periodically into the region, and with Hittite and Hurrian elements filtering in from Anatolia. For any group rising here, adaptation to this diversity was not just useful, but necessary for survival. The political scene in the centuries before the Arameans is equally instructive. During the Late Bronze Age, the Levant and Syria were contested zones between the great empires of Egypt, Hatti, and Mitanni, later joined by the rising Assyrian and Babylonian states. The so-called Amarna letters, a collection of diplomatic correspondence from the 14th century BCE, provide evidence of how local rulers in Syria and Canaan negotiated their position between these imperial powers. The letters often mention pressures from mobile groups and mercenary bands, reminding us again of the constant interplay between the great centres and the tribal confederations around them. The Arameans, though not yet explicitly named in these records, were part of this broader world of tribal mobility that imperial scribes frequently worried about. When considering the prehistory of the Arameans, one must also look at the collapse of the Late Bronze Age around 1200 BCE. This period saw widespread upheavals across the Near East and Eastern Mediterranean. The Hittite Empire disintegrated, Egyptian power receded, and urban centres from Anatolia to Canaan were destroyed or abandoned. Scholars debate the causes, some pointing to climate change and drought, others to invasions by the so-called Sea Peoples, still others to internal rebellions and systemic economic stress. But the result was a profound weakening of central authorities. It is precisely in the wake of this collapse that the Arameans begin to appear in clearer form in historical sources. Their rise was not accidental. It was part of the larger reshaping of the ancient Near East after the decline of the great Late Bronze Age powers. The vacuum of authority created conditions in which mobile tribal groups could seize opportunities, settle into weakened regions, and establish their own polities. The languages spoken across the Fertile Crescent in this period also shaped the environment into which the Arameans emerged. Akkadian remained the prestige language of administration and diplomacy, particularly in its Assyrian and Babylonian dialects. Hurrian was still spoken in parts of northern Mesopotamia and Syria, while Canaanite dialects dominated along the Levantine coast and inland valleys. Into this linguistic patchwork, the early Aramaic tongue would eventually enter, drawing on its Semitic kinship with Akkadian, Amorite, and Canaanite. The eventual rise of Aramaic as the lingua franca of the Near East cannot be understood without appreciating how multilingual the region already was. This background of shifting languages and scripts meant that the adoption of Aramaic by empires like Assyria and Persia was both revolutionary and yet also part of a longer tradition of linguistic adaptation in the service of empire. The religious landscape before the Arameans is equally important to survey. Temples to storm gods, fertility goddesses, and solar deities dotted the region from Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean. Baal, Hadad, Ishtar, Shamash, and countless local gods had their cult centres. Religion was not unified but highly local, with each city maintaining its patron deity and ritual calendar. Yet similarities of form, altars, sacrifices, festivals, divination practices, created a shared cultural environment that mobile groups could quickly adapt to. For people like the Arameans, who would later blend their tribal traditions with the religious structures of the lands they entered, this flexible religious environment allowed for integration without complete assimilation. The gods of Damascus, for instance, would later be understood in terms recognizable to both local Levantines and neighboring Mesopotamians, showing how adaptive the Aramean approach to religion became. Trade and communication networks that predated the Arameans also played a central role in shaping their rise. Caravans moving through the Syrian desert linked Mesopotamian cities with Mediterranean ports. Tin, copper, textiles, wine, and olive oil circulated across these routes. The oases and watering points of the Syrian steppe became vital nodes of survival and commerce. For pastoral groups accustomed to navigating these spaces, control of caravan routes offered opportunities not only for plunder, but also for integration into long-distance trade. Later Assyrian annals frequently mention Aramean tribes disrupting or controlling such routes, which underlines how the geography of trade shaped political struggles. Without this well-established network of exchange, the Arameans would have had fewer avenues for asserting influence. The demographic shifts of the 12th and 11th centuries BCE further frame the context for the Arameans' appearance. As centralized states weakened, populations dispersed. Some communities abandoned long-inhabited urban centres for smaller, more defensible towns, or for mobile pastoral strategies. Archaeological surveys across Syria and the Levant reveal patterns of site abandonment alongside the growth of new villages and small towns, often in regions previously sparsely populated. This settlement shift matches the historical reports of new tribal groups pressing into the region, of which the Arameans were a major component. The very landscape of habitation changed, creating a mosaic of urban survivors, new villages, and nomadic encampments. The stage was thus set for groups like the Arameans to leave a permanent mark. The Assyrian royal inscriptions from the early 1st millennium BCE provide some of the earliest specific mentions of the Arameans, but before they appear explicitly, these inscriptions already show kings dealing with restless tribes on the empire's periphery. The constant campaigns to secure borders, to protect trade, and to assert authority in the Euphrates Valley reveal a pattern of struggle into which the Arameans seamlessly entered. To understand these texts is to understand that the world before the Arameans was already unstable, dynamic, and filled with shifting alliances. Their rise was a continuation of processes that had been shaping the region for centuries. The agricultural techniques of the Fertile Crescent before the Arameans also deserve consideration. Irrigation systems in Mesopotamia were already sophisticated, involving canals, levees, and reservoirs that required centralized administration and labor coordination. In contrast, the more rainfall-dependent agriculture of the Levant produced smaller surpluses, but allowed for more localized autonomy. Pastoralism in the steppe was equally adapted to these environmental conditions, with herders timing their seasonal movements to the rhythms of rainfall and vegetation. These differences in subsistence created enduring cultural contrasts between urban states and tribal confederations, but also opportunities for exchange. The Arameans, by drawing on both traditions, became adept at moving between pastoral and settled life, an adaptability that proved to be one of their greatest strengths. Even metallurgy, craft production, and military technologies of the pre-Aramean world shaped their possibilities. Bronze weaponry and later iron tools were already in circulation. Chariots had transformed warfare in the late Bronze Age, and fortifications had become a standard feature of cities throughout Syria and Mesopotamia. When the Arameans began forming their own kingdoms, they inherited not only the political vacuum of a weakened world, but also the technological repertoire of centuries of development. Their fortresses, their armies, and their crafts did not appear in a void, but in the well-established context of the ancient Near East. In this complex environment of collapsing empires, shifting populations, multilingual exchanges, diverse religious practices, and intricate trade networks, the Arameans first entered the stage of recorded history. To trace their emergence, one must appreciate the immense weight of the world that came before them, because it was within this layered cultural and political setting that they could transform from tribal groups moving across the steppes into established polities that reshaped the balance of power in the Levant and Mesopotamia. Their story begins not as an isolated narrative, but as the continuation of long-standing dynamics in the Fertile Crescent, and it is into this turbulent and opportunity-laden world that they stepped, gradually making themselves known to both allies and adversaries who would soon record their name. The earliest clear traces of the Arameans emerge not from their own records, for they left no great archive of stone inscriptions or monumental texts in this early phase, but from the writings of their neighbours, who observed their movements with a mixture of suspicion and anxiety. Mesopotamian scribes, trained in traditions that stretched back to the age of Sumer, wrote in Akkadian, and it is in their tablets that the name of the Arameans first appears. The context of these mentions is important, for for the scribes of the Assyrian and Babylonian courts did not usually devote ink to groups they considered marginal unless they posed a real problem for stability. When the name of a new people entered their records, it signalled that this group had become a force large enough to disrupt existing patterns of power, trade, or settlement. In the late 12th and early 11th centuries BCE, Assyria was still recovering from the disruptions that had shaken the ancient Near East. The empire that had once projected power deep into Anatolia and Syria found itself reduced, defending its core territories along the Tigris and upper Mesopotamia. It was in this weakened condition that the Arameans began to press into the Euphrates Valley and beyond. The earliest inscriptions that mention them describe raids, incursions, and the seizure of lands that had long been settled under imperial authority. The Arameans, moving in tribal confederations, established footholds in territories that Assyrian kings claimed as their own, and the scribes recorded their names with growing irritation. The term Ahlamu Arameans appears in these early texts, linking them with a broader category of nomadic groups that Mesopotamian scribes lumped together under the label Ahlamu. This designation had long been used to refer to tribal peoples who wandered the fringes of settled lands, herding animals, and sometimes raiding fields and caravans. By attaching the qualifier Aramean, the scribes distinguished a particular subset of these nomadic populations, one that was becoming especially prominent in the Syrian steppe and the Middle Euphrates region. This distinction shows that by the late 12th century BCE, the Arameans were no longer just one more group among many. They had grown in numbers and influence to the point where their identity could not be ignored. Royal inscriptions from Tiglath-Pileser I, who reigned around 1114 to 1076 BCE, provide some of the most significant early references. In the annals of his campaigns, the king boasts of defeating Aramean groups that had crossed the Euphrates and threatened Assyrian-controlled territories. His texts describe how the Arameans repeatedly attacked, withdrew into the desert, and re-emerged, forcing the Assyrian army into continual pursuit. These descriptions reveal the difficulty settled empires had in dealing with mobile tribal forces. Unlike fortified cities that could be besieged and conquered, nomadic groups could disperse, evade, and regroup. Tiglath-Pileser's scribes emphasized his victories, as royal inscriptions always did, but the very frequency with which they mention Aramean raids suggests that the problem was persistent and unresolved. The Mari and Suhu regions along the Middle Euphrates are often cited in these texts as zones of Aramean activity. These lands, rich in agricultural potential and strategically important as crossroads between Mesopotamia and Syria, became contested ground. Assyrian kings sent repeated expeditions to secure them, yet the inscriptions admit that the Arameans established lasting footholds there. Over time, what began as raids turned into settlement. The process by which Aramean tribes moved from mobile pastoralism to settled life is not fully detailed in the texts, but the evidence suggests that the collapse of earlier urban centres left vacant lands and weakened defences that the Arameans exploited. Gradually they ceased to be just raiders and became landholders, building the foundation for the kingdoms that would emerge in later centuries. The Babylonian records also begin to mention the Arameans around this period, though with slightly different emphasis. Where the Assyrian texts often stress the military threat, the Babylonian sources highlight the disruption of agriculture and the seizure of villages along the Euphrates. Babylon, like Assyria, was a state in recovery during the early first millennium, and its weakened administration struggled to contain the encroachments of tribal groups. The chronicles lament the loss of fields and canals to Aramean control, reflecting the dependence of Mesopotamian civilization on the delicate balance of irrigation agriculture. To lose territory to a tribal group was not merely a political embarrassment, it was an economic catastrophe that threatened the very subsistence of the kingdom. These early mentions also reveal the geographical spread of the Arameans. By the 11th century BCE, they are reported not only along the Middle Euphrates, but also pushing into areas closer to the Habur River and the fringes of northern Mesopotamia. the texts describe different Aramean tribal designations, suggesting that what modern historians call the Arameans was not a single unified people, but a collection of related groups, each with its own leadership, yet sharing language and culture enough to be recognised collectively. This tribal diversity would remain a defining feature of their history, for even when they established kingdoms, they did so as a network of local powers rather than as a centralised empire. One striking aspect of these early records is the tone with which the scribes describe the Arameans. They are depicted as relentless, hard to control and resistant to subjugation. Campaigns are recorded in which the king drove them into the desert, only for them to reappear the following season. This image of elusive, mobile enemies reflects the deep-seated tension between sedentary empires and nomadic peoples. For the Assyrians, whose military system relied on seizing cities and exacting tribute, the Arameans posed a unique challenge. Their ability to survive in the steppe, to retreat when pressured, and to return when conditions favoured them made them a frustrating and dangerous opponent. As the 11th century progressed, the frequency of references to the Arameans increased. This escalation suggests not only that they were becoming more numerous, but also that they were pressing deeper into territories that had once been firmly under imperial control. In some inscriptions, entire regions are described as taken by the Arameans, language that acknowledges a shift from temporary raids to more permanent occupation. These texts, written by kings determined to assert their dominance, still betray a sense that the balance of power was changing. The Arameans, once marginal, had become a fixture in the political landscape of Mesopotamia. The way the Assyrian and Babylonian scribes grouped the Arameans with other semi-nomadic peoples also sheds light on ancient perceptions of identity. Names like Sutu, Ahlamu, and Aramean appear in overlapping contexts, sometimes distinguished, sometimes conflated. This fluidity indicates that from the perspective of urban scribes, the distinctions between different tribal groups were not always clear or important. What mattered was their role as outsiders pressing on the agricultural heartlands. Yet the fact that Aramean eventually became the dominant term suggests that these particular tribes outlasted or overshadowed others, establishing a more enduring identity. By the 10th century BCE, the inscriptions begin to show that the Arameans were not only raiding but also building settlements, fortresses, and eventually political entities recognizable as kingdoms. This development marks a turning point, for it demonstrates how a people who first appear as nomadic raiders in the records of their enemies gradually transitioned into rulers of territories themselves. The continuity of their name across centuries of Mesopotamian records is evidence of how successful they were in embedding themselves into the geopolitical fabric of the Near East. The first mentions of the Arameans, then, are not merely footnotes in the annals of Assyrian and Babylonian kings. They are the starting point of a transformation, a moment when scribes noticed that new tribes were pressing into the heartlands, too numerous to dismiss, too mobile to eradicate, too persistent to ignore. From the perspective of those scribes, the Arameans were a nuisance, a danger, a recurring problem. From our perspective, these mentions are the earliest hints of a people who would eventually shape the languages, politics and cultures of the Near East for centuries to come. And as the Arameans grew in strength, the next stage of their story would be written not only in the complaints of their enemies, but also in the enduring structures they themselves built across Syria and Mesopotamia. The early descriptions of the Arameans in Mesopotamian inscriptions portray them as elusive figures, slipping across borders, raiding, and retreating back into the desert. To understand why they appeared this way, it is necessary to examine the foundations of their pastoral life and the organisation of their tribes in the steppes that stretched between the cultivated zones of Mesopotamia and the barren deserts beyond. These lands, often seen by sedentary civilizations as hostile and marginal, provided the ecological framework in which the Arameans developed their resilience, mobility, and ability to survive without the walls of cities or the canals of irrigation systems. The steppe environment where the Arameans roamed was neither entirely desert nor fully fertile. It was a transitional zone where seasonal rains could bring patches of green pastures, yet where scarcity was always near. In such conditions, mobility was not a choice, but a necessity. Herds of sheep, goats, and later camels provided the main source of sustenance, but these animals required constant movement to find fresh grazing. The Arameans, like many other Semitic-speaking pastoralists before them, organised their lives around these cycles of movement, timing their migrations with the rains, the growth of grasses, and the availability of water in wadis and oases. This rhythm of mobility created societies that valued flexibility, endurance, and the ability to respond swiftly to changing conditions. Pastoral life shaped their material culture. Their dwellings were portable, likely consisting of tents made from woven goat hair or wool that could be dismantled and carried as the herds moved. Cooking was done with simple implements that could be transported easily, and storage of goods was minimal, emphasizing the essentials of food, water, and animal products. Clothing reflected the demands of the climate. Wool garments provided insulation against cold nights, while lighter wraps suited the heat of the day. Everything in their material life reflected adaptation to mobility and resilience against scarcity. Archaeological remains of nomadic groups are sparse compared to those of settled civilizations, but ethnographic parallels and scattered finds suggest that the Arameans lived in ways consistent with the broader traditions of Semitic-speaking herders across the region. Social organisation followed the necessities of pastoralism. The basic unit was the kin group, centred on extended families that shared herds and moved together. These family units were linked into larger tribal groupings through ties of blood, marriage, and alliance. Leadership tended to be fluid, with authority resting on elders, successful warriors, or those able to provide for the tribe in difficult times. Unlike the rigid bureaucracies of Mesopotamian states, tribal leadership was often situational, reflecting the immediate needs of survival, war, or negotiation. This flexibility made it difficult for sedentary empires to impose lasting control over them, since no single ruler could be captured or deposed to dissolve the whole tribal network. The Arameans, however, were not anarchic. Rules of hospitality, obligations of kinship, and the sanctity of oaths bound their society together. Oral traditions carried the weight of law, ensuring that disputes could be resolved within the tribe and that cooperation remained possible even in times of scarcity. Over time, as Aramean groups grew larger and settled in certain regions, these tribal structures provided the framework for the political entities that developed into city kingdoms. But in their early history, this organisation allowed them to survive and even thrive in the margins where empires struggled to exert control. The economy of pastoralism produced goods that were highly valued by sedentary neighbours. Wool, hides, meat, and milk products flowed from the herds, while animals themselves, especially sheep and camels, were commodities in demand. This created opportunities for exchange. Nomads could trade with farmers for grain, dates, and other agricultural products, or with urban centres for metal tools and luxury goods. Yet the same mobility that allowed them to engage in trade also allowed them to raid when relations soured or when shortages pressed too hard. The duality of trade and raiding was a defining feature of pastoral-urban interaction, and the Arameans embodied it as much as any group before them. The introduction of the camel into Near Eastern pastoralism, which became increasingly prominent in the early first millennium, transformed the range and resilience of nomadic groups. Camels, able to carry heavy loads and endure long stretches without water, expanded the horizons of trade and migration across the steppe. Though it is debated precisely when the Arameans adopted camels on a wide scale, their role as caravan intermediaries in later centuries suggests that camel pastoralism became central to their way of life. This adaptation gave them a mobility and logistical capacity that further distinguished them from other tribal groups, and helped explain how they could project influence across such wide territories. The Arameans' tribal organisation was also marked by fragmentation into numerous named groups, which appear in the inscriptions of their neighbours. Each of these groups occupied different territories or followed different migratory patterns, but collectively they were recognised as sharing language and cultural practices. This mosaic of tribes reflected the decentralisation of authority, but also provided resilience. When one group was defeated or displaced, others could continue the struggle, ensuring that the Aramean presence could not be eradicated by a single campaign. The cultural values of pastoralism emphasised toughness, courage, and loyalty to kin. Stories and traditions passed orally through generations preserved the memory of migrations, battles, and pacts. While few of these narratives survive directly, echoes of them appear in the later literary traditions of the Near East, where Aramean figures appear in the backgrounds of Israelite, Assyrian, and Babylonian accounts. These traditions often emphasize the persistence and resilience of the Arameans, qualities born from their life in the steppe. The steppe environment also shaped their military style. Accustomed to mobility, Aramean warriors were skilled at quick raids, ambushes, and retreats into the desert. Their intimate knowledge of the terrain gave them advantages over the armies of sedentary states, which relied on heavy infantry and chariots more suited to open battlefields. Aramean tactics frustrated Assyrian kings, whose inscriptions complain of their enemies' habit of disappearing into barren lands where armies could not easily follow. This military culture, rooted in pastoral mobility, would later adapt to more settled forms of warfare as Arameans built fortified towns and fielded armies of their own. The fluidity of tribal organisation also made diplomacy an essential skill. Leaders who could negotiate with neighbouring states, secure alliances, or manage relationships with other tribes ensured survival and prosperity. Aramean chiefs likely served as both warriors and negotiators, balancing the needs of their people with the opportunities and threats posed by powerful empires nearby. These abilities, honed in the uncertain environment of the steppe, later allowed Aramean rulers to play significant roles on the regional stage once they established permanent kingdoms. Religious life among the Arameans in this early nomadic phase is harder to reconstruct, but it likely shared much with the broader Semitic traditions of the Near East. Deities associated with storms, fertility, and protection of kin groups would have been central, with rituals adapted to a mobile lifestyle. Portable shrines, sacred stones, and simple offerings at oases or high places could substitute for the great temples of settled peoples. The fluidity of their religion allowed the Arameans to adopt and adapt local cults as they settled, a pattern seen later in their urban centres where their gods merged with those of the Canaanites, Mesopotamians, and others. Over time, the cumulative effect of pastoral lifeways, tribal organisation, and interactions with neighbours was to create a people who were both distinct and adaptable. They were distinct in their endurance, their ability to survive in marginal lands, and their tribal identities that resisted assimilation. Yet they were adaptable in their willingness to trade, to integrate new technologies like the camel, and to adopt elements of local religion and culture. This combination made them uniquely suited to the turbulent centuries of the early first millennium, when old empires faltered and new powers rose. The image of the Arameans as nomads of the steppe, recorded with frustration in the annals of Assyrian kings, captures only one phase of their long history. Yet it is the foundation on which all else was built. The pastoral life taught them resilience, the tribal structures gave them cohesion, and the mobility of the steppe endowed them with the ability to evade, to raid, and eventually to settle when the opportunity arose. From these beginnings, the Arameans would soon move beyond being elusive raiders to become rulers of towns and territories, carving out a network of kingdoms that would dominate the political map of Syria and the Levant for centuries to come. The transformation of the Arameans from elusive nomads of the steppe into the rulers of recognized chiefdoms and eventually kingdoms did not happen in a single moment, nor was it the product of one leader or one decisive conquest. It was the cumulative result of decades of tribal movement, opportunistic settlement, and gradual integration into the social and political structures of the regions where they established themselves. To trace this transformation, it is necessary to look closely at how groups that had once been described as raiders and wanderers became rooted in the fertile valleys of the Euphrates, the Orontes, and the lands of inland Syria, until they were known not merely as tribes on the periphery, but as rulers of places with names, towns, and enduring traditions. The steppe and the margins of cultivated lands had long been areas where tribes could press in during times of imperial weakness. The Arameans exploited these circumstances with particular success in the centuries after the collapse of the great Late Bronze Age powers. As Hittite control receded from Syria, as Mitanni disappeared from the stage, and as Egypt's hold on Canaan weakened, the interior of Syria became a landscape of opportunity. Urban centres that had once depended on imperial support struggled to maintain themselves, and the lands between them often fell into neglect. It was here, in these vulnerable stretches of countryside and along the river valleys that still held promise for cultivation, that Aramean groups began to anchor themselves. The earlier stage of settlement likely took the form of seasonal encampments that gradually became semi-permanent. Tribes accustomed to moving with their flocks found regions where water, pasture and farmland were sufficient to support longer stays. In some cases, they may have settled near abandoned or weakened towns, using the remnants of earlier civilizations as foundations for new communities. Archaeological layers from the early Iron Age in parts of Syria show patterns of resettlement that correspond with this process. Smaller towns emerging where once larger Bronze Age centres had stood, pottery styles shifting to reflect new cultural influences, and fortifications being rebuilt on a more modest scale. The Arameans were not alone in this reshaping of the landscape, but they were among the most successful groups in turning these conditions to their advantage. The process of becoming rooted also involved changes in social and political organisation. Tribal leadership, once focused on mobility and survival, evolved into forms of authority suited to settled life. Chiefs emerged who could coordinate not only the movements of herds, but also the defence of fields, the negotiation of trade and the construction of fortifications. These leaders drew on their prestige within the tribe, but they also began to assume titles and roles that mirrored those of neighbouring urban rulers. It is in this phase that the Arameans began to transition from being described as simply tribes in Assyrian inscriptions to being recognised as rulers of territories with fixed names. Bitadini, Bitagusi, and Bitsamani are examples of such early Aramean polities. The use of the prefix bit, meaning house of, reflected the tribal origins of these settlements, for each was understood as the domain of a particular lineage or extended kin group. What had once been a tribal designation became the name of a territorial state. This pattern is crucial for understanding the political culture of the Arameans. Their kingdoms were extensions of tribal identity, rooted in family lineages and the authority of chiefs who had successfully transitioned into kingship. Unlike the centralized empires of Mesopotamia, these polities remained relatively small, often controlling a city and its surrounding countryside rather than vast expanses. Yet their number and their persistence gave the Arameans a collective presence that reshaped the political map of Syria and the upper Mesopotamian plain. Damascus, which would later become the most famous of all Aramean centres, emerged in this period as one of many such settlements. Its location in the fertile Ghouta plain, watered by the Brada River and protected by surrounding mountains, made it an ideal site for a rising polity. Though Damascus had older roots as a settlement, its transformation into the capital of an Aramean kingdom was part of the broader process by which tribal groups seized control of strategic locations and built them into centres of power. The eventual prominence of Damascus should not obscure the fact that it was only one among many Aramean strongholds that arose during this early phase. The relationship between these emerging chiefdoms and their neighbours was complex. On the one hand, they continued the traditions of raiding and mobility that had characterised their nomadic past. Assyrian annals of the 10th and 9th centuries repeatedly describe campaigns against Aramean states, and these inscriptions show that conflict remained frequent. On the other hand, the very fact that Assyrian kings listed these names demonstrates that the Arameans were no longer simply raiders without fixed homes. They had become rulers of places, possessors of lands that could be taxed, defended, and besieged. The shift from mobility to settlement changed the nature of their interactions with empires, making them both more vulnerable and more influential. Trade routes played a decisive role in this process. The Euphrates corridor, long a highway of communication between Mesopotamia and Syria, passed directly through territories that the Arameans came to dominate. Control of crossing points, watering stations, and caravan routes provided revenue and leverage. The same skills that had once made them formidable raiders, knowledge of terrain, ability to mobilize quickly and control of mobile herds, now made them effective rulers of strategic trade hubs. Assyrian campaigns against them often had the aim of reopening these trade routes, underscoring how central Aramean control had become to the flow of goods across the region. Culturally, the transition to settlement did not erase their tribal identity. The persistence of bit designations for their kingdoms demonstrates that they continued to see themselves in terms of family and lineage. Yet as they built towns, adopted local architectural forms, and integrated with surrounding populations, they also absorbed new cultural influences. Temples to local gods were rebuilt under Aramean rulers, and inscriptions from later centuries show that they adopted the writing systems and artistic conventions of their neighbours. This cultural fusion was a hallmark of the Aramean experience, rooted in tribal identity, yet adaptable enough to thrive in urban and multi-ethnic environments. The evidence for early Aramean settlements also comes from the negative perspective of their enemies. Assyrian kings, particularly from the reign of Ashurnasirpal II onward, record repeated wars against Aramean rulers who had fortified their towns and formed alliances with each other. These conflicts reveal that the Arameans were not isolated tribes, but interconnected polities capable of coordinated resistance. Their fortifications, described in siege accounts, suggest that they quickly mastered the arts of urban defence. The Assyrian frustration with them reflects both their resilience and their importance. Archaeology adds further dimension. Excavations at sites in Syria and along the Euphrates reveal layers of occupation from the early Iron Age that show the modest beginnings of Aramean towns. Houses built with mud brick on stone foundations, storage facilities for grain, and modest fortification walls point to communities that were stable but not yet wealthy. Over time, these settlements grew in complexity, reflecting the accumulation of resources and the centralization of authority under tribal chiefs who now acted as kings. Cylinder seals, pottery styles, and inscriptions gradually show the blending of Aramean traditions with Mesopotamian and Levantine forms, evidence of cultural integration that mirrored their political consolidation. The transition from nomads to settlers also reshaped their military. Warriors who had once relied on mobility and raids adapted to defending towns and organizing armies. They retained their skills in quick strikes and desert warfare, but they also adopted siege techniques, cavalry, and the construction of fortifications. This combination of old and new made them formidable opponents. When they confronted Assyrian armies, they could retreat into the desert, but they could also stand behind walls and resist sieges. This dual capacity made them both frustrating and dangerous, prolonging their presence as rivals to imperial expansion. The rise of these early chiefdoms must also be understood in terms of generational change. The elders who remembered the life of constant migration gave way to younger leaders who grew up in fortified towns, accustomed to agriculture as well as herding. Oral traditions adapted to these new realities, preserving the memory of tribal mobility while legitimizing the authority of rulers who now presided over settled populations. Religion too adapted, as tribal deities were anchored to temples and associated with local places. The process was gradual, but by the 10th century BCE, The Arameans had become a people of towns and fields as much as of tents and herds. This transformation did not mean the end of their nomadic heritage. Many tribes remained mobile, and even settled kingdoms maintained ties to pastoral life. Herds continued to be important sources of wealth, and seasonal migrations did not disappear. The Aramean identity was thus a blend, settled rulers of towns and fields yet still connected to the traditions of the steppe. This dual identity allowed them to navigate the pressures of empire, trade and diplomacy with remarkable flexibility. The rise of Aramean chiefdoms and their early settlements set the stage for their expansion into full-fledged kingdoms. As they took root in the Euphrates Valley, in the Orontes Basin, and in the plains of Damascus, they positioned themselves as enduring players in the politics of the Near East. The story of their emergence from tents into towns illustrates not only their adaptability, but also the changing character of the ancient world in the wake of the Bronze Age collapse. From this foundation, the Arameans would soon confront the full might of Assyria and Babylon, not as elusive tribes on the margins, but as rulers of lands that empires desired to control. As the Aramean chiefdoms grew from small tribal settlements into recognized political entities, they found themselves increasingly entangled with the two great powers that dominated the Mesopotamian world, Assyria and Babylonia. These encounters were not occasional but constant, forming the very texture of the early first millennium BCE. The Arameans did not exist on the margins of these empires as distant observers. They lived along the borders, occupied the trade routes, and established settlements in lands the kings of Assur and Babylon claimed as their own. Inevitably, this proximity produced conflict, negotiation, and adaptation. The story of the Arameans in this period is inseparable from the campaigns, treaties, and shifting fortunes of these imperial neighbours. Assyria, more than any other state, recorded its dealings with the Arameans in detail. Its kings, determined to display their prowess and justify their rule, left behind annals inscribed on stone and clay that listed the peoples they fought. In these annals, the Arameans appear repeatedly, sometimes as raiders along the Euphrates, sometimes as rulers of fortified towns, sometimes as allies or subjects who'd been subdued and forced to provide tribute. These records, though written from the perspective of imperial propaganda, provide invaluable evidence for the scale and persistence of Aramean power. The reign of Tiglath-Pileser already revealed the pattern. Repeated campaigns westward to confront tribes who crossed the Euphrates and threatened Assyrian authority. His inscriptions describe battles in which thousands of Arameans were killed or captured, their camps burned, and their herds driven off. Yet the same inscriptions complain that they returned again and again, undeterred by temporary defeats. This cycle of conquest and resurgence defined the relationship for generations. Unlike a single city-state that could be destroyed, the Arameans were numerous, spread across a wide area, and able to regroup even after devastating losses. As Aramean settlements became more permanent, Assyrian kings began to target them not only in the open steppe, but within their fortified towns. Ashurnasirpal II, who ruled in the 9th century BCE, is remembered for his brutal campaigns westward. His annals describe the siege and capture of Aramean strongholds, the deportation of populations, and the imposition of tribute. The ferocity of his descriptions, the flaying of rebels, the stacking of corpses, the humiliation of captives, was meant to terrify both enemies and subjects. But behind the rhetoric, what emerges is the recognition that the Arameans had built towns worth besieging and treasuries worth plundering. They were no longer shadowy tribes, but rulers with resources that an empire coveted. The relationship with Babylonia followed a different trajectory. Babylon, lying to the south, was often weaker than Assyria in this period, its kings preoccupied with internal struggles and external pressures. The Arameans exploited this weakness by pressing into Babylonian territory, seizing villages and sometimes whole districts. Babylonian chronicles lament the destruction caused by Aramean incursions, describing how fields were abandoned and canals fell into disrepair. These accounts reveal the vulnerability of a sedentary society to mobile groups who could strike, withdraw, and return unpredictably. The agricultural base of Babylonian power depended on delicate irrigation systems. Disruption by Aramean raids had consequences far beyond the immediate loss of livestock or grain. It undermined the stability of the entire state. Over time, however, some Aramean groups shifted from being merely destructive forces to becoming integral parts of Babylonian society. Tribes settled along the rivers, integrated into local communities, and even rose to prominence within the political structure. The porous boundaries between nomads and settlers meant that yesterday's raiders could become tomorrow's farmers or officials. Babylonian society, accustomed to absorbing new groups over centuries, gradually incorporated Arameans into its population. Yet the memory of their incursions lingered in chronicles that portrayed them as perennial sources of disorder. The dual role of the Arameans as both disruptors and settlers explains much about their encounters with empires. To the Assyrians, they were enemies to be defeated, but also tributaries to be exploited. To the Babylonians, they were raiders who destroyed, but also neighbours who eventually became part of the community. This ambiguity was not accidental. It reflected the strategies of Aramean tribes themselves, who could resist imperial power when strong, submit when weak, and adapt as circumstances demanded. Assyrian annals of the 9th and 8th centuries BCE show the gradual intensification of efforts to bring Aramean polities under control. Shalmaneser III, who campaigned widely in Syria, lists numerous Aramean rulers among his opponents. His famous monolith inscription records the Battle of Karkar in 853 BCE, where a coalition of Levantine and Aramean kings, including Hadadezer of Damascus, resisted Assyrian expansion. Though Shalmaneser claimed victory, the very fact that such a coalition could form demonstrates the strength of Aramean states by this period. They were no longer isolated tribes resisting at the margins, but established kingdoms capable of coordinating with other powers in defence of their autonomy. The Assyrian strategy toward the Arameans evolved over time. Initial campaigns aimed to punish and deter raids. Later, as Aramean states became entrenched, the goal shifted to conquest, tribute, and incorporation. Deportations became a favoured tool, with entire populations uprooted and resettled in distant parts of the empire. This not only weakened resistance at home, but also spread Aramean communities throughout Mesopotamia. Ironically, these forced migrations contributed to the spread of the Aramaic language, which would later become the lingua franca of the Near East under imperial sponsorship. What Assyrian kings intended as a means of control became one of the greatest vehicles of Aramean cultural influence. In Babylonia, the story was somewhat different but equally significant. Aramean tribes established themselves in southern Mesopotamia, where they were sometimes regarded as rivals, sometimes as allies. The chronicles mention periods when Aramean groups dominated whole regions, only to be pushed back by local rulers. In the long run, they became part of the fabric of Babylonian society, their names and traditions blending into the local population. The presence of Arameans in Babylonian territory illustrates both the weakness of Babylon during this period and the absorptive capacity of its culture. Unlike Assyria, which fought relentlessly to assert dominance, Babylon often accommodated and assimilated. The persistence of the Arameans in the face of imperial pressure demonstrates their resilience. For centuries, Assyrian kings recorded victories over them, yet they never succeeded in eradicating them. Instead, the Arameans adapted, shifting locations, building alliances, and exploiting the gaps between imperial campaigns. They were small-scale powers, but their numbers, mobility, and adaptability made them enduring. This resilience was rooted in their tribal organization, which allowed them to fragment under pressure and regroup later, and in their dual economy of herding and farming, which enabled them to adjust to both mobility and settlement. The encounters between the Arameans and the empires were not only military and political, but also cultural. Through contact with Assyria and Babylonia, they absorbed architectural styles, artistic motifs, and administrative practices. The use of cuneiform inscriptions in some Aramean states shows direct borrowing from Mesopotamian traditions, even as the Arameans gradually promoted their own alphabetic script. Temples to gods like Hadad reveal syncretism, combining local and Mesopotamian elements. In diplomacy, they adopted the conventions of treaties and alliances familiar in the imperial world. These cultural exchanges were not one-sided. While the Arameans borrowed, they also contributed. Their language, Aramaic, gradually gained ground as a practical medium of communication, favoured for its simplicity compared to cuneiform. Over time, even Assyrian officials adopted it for everyday use. The memory of these encounters is preserved in texts that oscillate between fear and disdain. Assyrian inscriptions describe Aramean enemies as rebellious and treacherous, yet they acknowledge their persistence. Babylonian chronicles lament their destructive raids, but testify to their integration. Biblical narratives mention them as both adversaries and kin, reflecting the ambivalent relationship Israel had with its Aramean neighbours. Together, these sources present a people who could not be easily categorized, always present, always adapting, always forcing their powerful neighbours to contend with them. By the 8th century BCE, the pressure from Assyria intensified. Kings like Tiglath-Pileser III undertook systematic campaigns to dismantle Aramean states, turning them into provinces of the empire. Damascus, the greatest of the Aramean capitals, eventually fell to Assyrian might. Yet even in defeat, the Arameans left a legacy that endured. Their language spread farther under Assyrian administration than it could have under independent kingdoms, and their cultural influence continued to grow. The encounters that had begun as raids and retaliations became, in the long arc of history, the mechanism by which the Arameans imprinted themselves on the very empires that sought to suppress them. The shift from tribal confederations roaming the steppe to structured kingdoms commanding towns, fortresses, and agricultural hinterlands marked one of the most important turning points in the history of the Arameans. Their earliest mentions in Assyrian and Babylonian records had portrayed them as elusive, hard to control, and defined by mobility. Yet by the 10th and 9th centuries before the Common Era, the same records and archaeological remains begin to reveal a different reality. The Arameans were no longer only wanderers who appeared and vanished across the Euphrates. They had become rulers of identifiable domains, known by names that carried echoes of their tribal foundations, but that now referred to recognized political entities. Among these, Bitadini, Bitagusi, and Bitsamani stand out, along with numerous smaller houses and domains that collectively created a mosaic of Aramean power stretching across Syria and northern Mesopotamia. The naming conventions of these kingdoms reveal their origins. The use of Bit, meaning house of, followed by the name of a founding ancestor or ruling lineage, points back to the tribal structures from which they emerged. What had once been the house of a particular clan leader became the name of a territory. This continuity between kinship identity and territorial rule illustrates how deeply rooted Aramean polities were in their tribal past, even as they adapted to the demands of governance over land and cities. Instead of erasing their nomadic origins, the Aramean kingdoms institutionalized them, creating states that carried tribal memory into urban and agricultural settings. Bitadini, located along the Middle Euphrates, was one of the most prominent of these early states. Centered on the fortified town of Tel Barsip, Bitadini controlled both riverine agriculture and crucial crossing points that linked Mesopotamia with Syria. The location gave it strategic value out of proportion to its size. Assyrian annals frequently mention campaigns against Bitadini, not because it was vast, but because it sat astride the arteries of trade and movement that imperial kings sought to dominate. Its rulers could exact tolls on caravans, influence trade between east and west, and provide refuge for allies resisting Assyrian power. For decades, Bitadini remained a thorn in the side of Assyrian expansion. a reminder that even small Aramean kingdoms could wield outsized influence. Bitagusi, further to the west in the region of modern Aleppo, followed a similar trajectory. Its capital, Arpad, became a major stronghold, heavily fortified and positioned at a crossroads of routes connecting northern Syria to the Mediterranean and to the Euphrates. Archaeological evidence from this region shows the growth of urban life under Aramean rule, with pottery styles, architectural remains, and inscriptions reflecting both local traditions and broader Near Eastern influences. Arpad, as the centre of Bitagusi, would later play a crucial role in coalitions resisting Assyrian domination, underscoring the capacity of Aramean kingdoms to coordinate with one another and with neighbouring powers. Bit Zamani, in the northern Mesopotamian plain near the upper Tigris, illustrates the eastern reach of Aramean settlement. Positioned closer to Assyrian territory, it faced more immediate imperial pressure. Assyrian inscriptions describe how its rulers alternated between resistance and submission, reflecting the precarious position of a kingdom caught between asserting independence and accommodating the overwhelming force of a powerful neighbour. The existence of Bit Zamani demonstrates how the Arameans were not confined to Syria, but had extended their reach deep into Mesopotamia itself, embedding themselves in lands once considered part of the Assyrian core. These examples were not isolated. Numerous other Aramean houses dotted the landscape. Bit Bahiani at Guzana, Bit Halupe, Bit Amukani, and many more, each named after a lineage, each rooted in tribal identity, each governing a small but significant domain. Together they created a fragmented political map, in contrast to the centralized empires of the past. This fragmentation was not a weakness, but a strength, for it allowed flexibility. No single defeat could erase the Aramean presence. When one kingdom fell, others endured. When one ruler submitted, another resisted. The collective resilience of this mosaic of states made the Arameans formidable adversaries despite their lack of central coordination. The internal structure of these kingdoms reflects the blending of tribal and urban elements. Kingship was hereditary, rooted in the authority of leading lineages, yet it also required practical skills of administration and military leadership. Rulers were expected to protect their people, defend their towns, and manage relations with powerful neighbours. Councils of elders, remnants of tribal governance, may have continued to play a role, especially in legitimizing decisions. Temples and priesthoods also became centres of authority, integrating religious traditions into political life. The combination of kinship, religion, and military power gave these states a distinctive character, different from, but not entirely alien to the great empires around them. Economically, these kingdoms drew strength from both agriculture and trade. Settled in fertile valleys, they cultivated cereals, olives, grapes, and other crops, while herding continued to provide wool and meat. Their position along major trade routes gave them access to goods from far afield: metals from Anatolia, timber from Lebanon, textiles from Mesopotamia, and luxury items from the Mediterranean. By taxing and controlling this flow, Aramean rulers enriched their coffers and supported urban development. Excavations at sites like Tel Halaf, ancient Guzana, reveal palatial architecture and elaborate art that testify to the wealth some Aramean kingdoms accumulated. These were not mere tribal encampments, but centres of culture and prosperity. The political role of these states extended beyond their borders. They formed alliances with each other and with neighbouring non-Aramean powers, creating coalitions capable of resisting Assyrian campaigns. The famous Battle of Karkar in 853 BCE, though later in the story, illustrates how Aramean kingdoms like Bitagusi and Damascus could coordinate with Phoenicians, Israelites, and others. These alliances were not always stable, but they reflect the diplomatic sophistication of Aramean rulers, who understood that survival required cooperation against overwhelming imperial force. Religion within these kingdoms reveals both continuity and adaptation. Tribal deities associated with storms, fertility, and protection of kin groups were now anchored to temples in urban centres. The storm god Hadad, in particular, became a prominent figure, worshipped in Aramean capitals alongside other deities borrowed or adapted from neighbouring traditions. Inscriptions and reliefs show rituals, offerings, and divine symbols that blend Aramean and Mesopotamian elements. This syncretism reflects the adaptability of the Arameans, who preserved their identity while integrating into the religious landscape of the Near East. The artistic achievements of these states, especially in sculpture and architecture, reveal both local creativity and foreign influence. The Palace of Guzana, for example, yielded stone reliefs with distinctive Aramean styles, depicting gods, animals, and mythological creatures. These works, while influenced by Assyrian and Hittite traditions, display a unique aesthetic that became associated with Aramean identity. Through art and architecture, the Arameans expressed their legitimacy as rulers and their participation in the broader cultural life of the Near East. Assyrian annals, though hostile, provide valuable details about the strength of these kingdoms. Campaign after campaign was launched against them, often described in terms of sieges, tribute, and deportations. Yet the very need for repeated campaigns indicates that Aramean resistance was not easily crushed. Bitadini, for instance, withstood multiple Assyrian invasions before finally being annexed. Even after defeat, deported populations carried their language and traditions into other parts of the empire, spreading Aramean influence far beyond the borders of their homelands. The persistence of these kingdoms into the 9th and 8th centuries demonstrates the durability of Aramean political organisation. Despite constant pressure, they endured for generations, adapting their strategies, forging alliances, and building defences. Their resilience shaped the geopolitics of the region, forcing Assyria to devote immense resources to subduing them and delaying imperial consolidation in Syria for decades. The formation of these states also had long-term cultural consequences. As they built towns, patronised temples, and sponsored inscriptions, the Arameans contributed to the spread of their language and script. Aramaic inscriptions from this period show the development of an alphabetic system, distinct from cuneiform, more accessible and adaptable. This innovation, initially used in local contexts, would later become one of the most influential scripts in history, adopted by empires and religions across the Near East. The roots of this transformation lie in the Aramean kingdoms of the early Iron Age, where tribal tradition met urban governance and produced enduring cultural forms. From the perspective of their imperial neighbours, these kingdoms were obstacles to be overcome. From the perspective of the Arameans themselves, they were achievements of stability, identity, and power after centuries of mobility. They represented the fulfillment of a long process of adaptation, from tents in the steppe to palaces in towns, from fleeting raids to enduring polities. Their story did not end with their conquest, for even under imperial domination their cultural imprint remained strong. The rise of Bitadini, Bitagusi, Bitzamani, and others illustrates the capacity of the Arameans to reshape themselves in response to historical conditions. They seized the opportunities created by the collapse of older empires, filled the spaces left by abandoned or weakened cities, and built new political entities rooted in their tribal traditions but oriented toward urban and agricultural life. In doing so, they created a foundation for the next phase of their history, in which the greatest of their kingdoms, centred on Damascus, would emerge as a dominant power in the Levant, challenging Assyria itself and leaving a mark that would endure in both political memory and cultural legacy. Among all the Aramean kingdoms that emerged during the early first millennium before the Common Era, none would achieve the fame, power, and longevity of Damascus. The city, known for its fertile surroundings and strategic location, became the heart of a kingdom that not only resisted Assyrian expansion, but also shaped the politics of the Levant for generations. Damascus, as it came to be called, represents the peak of Aramean political development. a state that transformed from tribal roots into a formidable monarchy capable of building coalitions, waging long wars, and leaving an indelible mark on the history of the region. The foundations of Damascus as a settlement predated the Arameans. Archaeological and textual evidence suggests that the site had been occupied since the Bronze Age, benefiting from the natural fertility of the Cauta Plain, which was watered by the Barada River and sheltered by mountain ranges to the west and south. Its fertile fields produced grains, olives and fruits, while its location at the intersection of trade routes connected it with both Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean. By the time the Arameans rose to prominence, Damascus was already a desirable prize, a city whose resources and position gave it potential beyond that of most other towns in the region. When the Arameans established their control over Damascus, they inherited this legacy and added to it the vigour of a people accustomed to mobility, resilience, and adaptation. Unlike many other Aramean kingdoms which remained relatively small and vulnerable, Damascus had the resources to expand, to project power beyond its immediate territory, and to dominate neighbouring states. The rulers of Aram Damascus, drawing on their tribal authority and urban resources, built a kingdom that stood at the forefront of resistance to Assyria and engaged in a complex web of alliances and conflicts with Israel, Judah, Phoenicia, and other Levantine powers. The earliest rulers of Aram Damascus are not well documented, but by the 9th century BCE, kings such as Ben-Hadad I and Ben-Hadad II appear in both Assyrian inscriptions and biblical narratives. The name Ben-Hadad, meaning son of Hadad, reflects the prominence of the storm god Hadad in the city's religious life, anchoring the monarchy in divine legitimacy. These rulers are depicted as ambitious, assertive, and determined to extend their influence. Under their leadership, Damascus became not only a stronghold but a capital of a regional power. One of the defining features of Aram Damascus was its ability to forge alliances. The famous Battle of Kerkar in 853 BCE is a prime example. There, Hadadezer, often identified with Ben-Hadad II of Damascus, led a coalition of Levantine powers, including the kings of Israel, Hamath, and others, against the advancing forces of Shalmaneser III of Assyria. The Assyrian annals claim victory, as was customary, but the fact that the coalition held together and that Assyria did not immediately subdue the region suggests that Damascus succeeded in delaying imperial conquest. The role of Aram Damascus as leader of this alliance demonstrates its preeminence among Aramean states and its ability to act as a rallying point for resistance. Relations with Israel form another key dimension of Damascus's ascendancy. Biblical accounts describe cycles of war and alliance between the two states, often centering on control of territories in Transjordan and northern Israel. Stories of battles, shifting treaties, and rivalries fill the narratives of the books of Kings, reflecting the importance of this relationship in the memory of later generations. While the biblical texts present these events from an Israelite perspective, they nonetheless attest to the power of Damascus, which could threaten Israel's existence and force it into defensive alliances. The fact that Israel sometimes allied with Damascus against Assyria shows the pragmatic nature of Levantine politics, where yesterday's enemy could become today's partner in the face of imperial aggression. Economically, Damascus prospered from its fertile lands and its position on trade routes. Caravans passing through Syria connected Mesopotamia with the Mediterranean, and Damascus served as a hub where goods from Arabia, Phoenicia, and Anatolia converged. The city's markets would have been filled with textiles, metals, spices, and agricultural products, enriching its rulers and supporting its military ambitions. The wealth of Damascus allowed its kings to build fortifications, maintain armies, and patronize temples, establishing the city as both a political and religious centre. The military strength of Aram Damascus was one of its defining features. Its armies combined the mobility inherited from pastoral traditions with the siegecraft and infantry formations necessary for urban warfare. Chariots, cavalry, and fortified walls all played a role in its defence and expansion. Assyrian inscriptions describe repeated campaigns against Damascus, often requiring prolonged sieges and heavy losses. The difficulty Assyria faced in subduing the city speaks to its resilience and the determination of its rulers. Religious life in Damascus centered on Hadad, the storm god, whose cult was widespread among the Arameans. Temples dedicated to Hadad and other deities reinforced the sacred legitimacy of the monarchy. The use of divine names in royal titles such as Ben-Hadad reflects the close association between kingship and divine patronage. This religious foundation not only united the population, but also linked Damascus with the broader cultural traditions of the Levant, where storm gods and fertility deities dominated local pantheons. The Assyrian annals provide detailed accounts of their wars with Damascus. Shalmaneser III, for instance, records multiple campaigns against the city, listing the tribute demanded and the coalitions formed against him. Yet despite repeated invasions, Damascus maintained its independence for much of the 9th and 8th centuries, outlasting many of its Aramean neighbours. This persistence underscores its strength and the skill of its rulers in balancing diplomacy and warfare. By the 8th century BCE, however, the pressure from Assyria intensified. Kings like Adad-nirari III and Tiglath-Pileser III undertook systematic campaigns to bring Damascus to heel. Biblical and Assyrian records converge on the story of Tiglath-Pileser's conquest of Damascus in 732 BCE, during the reign of King Rezin. The fall of Damascus marked the end of its independence and the incorporation of its territory into the Assyrian Empire. Yet even in defeat, the legacy of Aram Damascus endured, for its prominence during the preceding centuries had established it as the greatest of the Aramean states. The cultural impact of Damascus extended beyond its political power. As the capital of the most prominent Aramean kingdom, it became a centre for the spread of the Aramaic language and script. Inscriptions from the city and its surroundings attest to the development of Aramaic as a medium of royal communication and religious expression. The prominence of Damascus helped secure the status of Aramaic as a language of administration and diplomacy, a role it would play across the Near East long after the fall of Aram Damascus itself. The memory of Damascus lived on in the traditions of its neighbours. Biblical texts recall its kings, its wars with Israel, and its eventual fall to Assyria. Assyrian inscriptions list it among the proudest conquests of their kings. Archaeological remains, though fragmentary, hint at the wealth and culture of the city during its peak. Together, these sources paint a picture of a kingdom that stood at the forefront of Aramean history, embodying both the strengths and the vulnerabilities of a people who had risen from tribal roots to urban power. The ascendancy of Aram Damascus represents more than just the story of a single city. It illustrates the capacity of the Arameans to adapt, to integrate their tribal traditions with urban life, and to resist the mightiest empire of their age. Damascus became a symbol of Aramean resilience, ambition, and cultural vitality. Its fall did not erase that legacy, but rather ensured that the memory of Aramean power would be preserved in the records of empires and the scriptures of neighbouring peoples. The story of Damascus naturally leads into the broader consideration of how Aramean kingdoms fought, defended themselves, and developed military strategies that allowed them to endure in a hostile world, shaping the next phase of their encounter with empire and neighbour alike. The story of the Arameans cannot be fully understood without examining the ways they fought, the defences they built, and the strategies they employed to resist powerful empires and to assert control over their own territories. From their earliest days as mobile tribes conducting raids across the steppe, to their later existence as rulers of fortified cities and organised kingdoms, warfare remained central to their identity and survival. The Arameans were not unique in facing the challenges of empire, but their methods reflected the dual heritage of a people who had lived both as nomads of the desert and as urban rulers of fertile plains. This blend of traditions created a distinctive approach to war and defence that made them resilient for centuries. The roots of Aramean military culture lay in pastoral mobility. The earliest descriptions of them in Assyrian records portray bands of warriors appearing suddenly, attacking villages or caravans, and disappearing back into the wilderness before regular armies could respond. This style of warfare, characterized by speed, surprise, and intimate knowledge of the terrain, reflected the survival skills of herders accustomed to constant movement. Lightly armed, relying on bows, spears, and simple shields, these warriors could strike where enemies were vulnerable and retreat before organized resistance could be mounted. For sedentary empires, accustomed to confronting fortified cities and set-piece battles, this guerrilla-like style was deeply frustrating. Campaigns were waged against them year after year, yet they always seemed to re-emerge, resilient and elusive. As the Arameans settled into towns and founded kingdoms, their military practices evolved. Settlement demanded defence, and defence required fortifications. Archaeological remains at sites such as Tel Halaf, ancient Guzana, Arpad, and Damascus reveal walls built of mud brick on stone foundations, towers at intervals for archers, and gates designed to resist assault. These were not the monumental defences of Assyria or Babylon, but they were effective against the kinds of warfare common in the Levant. Narrow streets and dense housing within these towns also created natural defences, making sieges costly and difficult for attackers. The investment in fortifications underscores the central role of warfare in Aramean political life, for rulers could not hope to maintain their authority without protecting their towns from imperial invasion. The Aramean kingdoms also developed organised armies that combined their pastoral traditions with the demands of settled life. Cavalry became increasingly important, especially as horses and camels allowed rapid movement across the steppe. Mounted warriors could conduct raids, scout enemy movements, and harass supply lines, maintaining the older nomadic style of mobility even as they defended urban centres. Infantry, drawn from settled populations, formed the backbone of defence during sieges and pitched battles. These infantrymen carried spears, swords, and shields, often fighting in loose formations suited to the varied terrain of Syria. The combination of mobile cavalry and sturdy infantry gave Aramean armies flexibility, enabling them to adapt to both open-field confrontations and defensive warfare behind walls. Weapons and armour reflected both local production and foreign influence. Bronze and later iron weapons were used, with swords, spears, and axes common. Bows, both simple and composite, provided ranged firepower, a skill likely honed during their nomadic past when hunting and raiding required accurate archery. Shields made of wood and covered with leather offered protection, while wealthier warriors may have worn helmets and body armour of bronze or iron scales. Compared to the heavily equipped Assyrian army, Aramean soldiers were lighter and more mobile, reflecting both economic realities and strategic preferences. Their style of fighting emphasized agility and adaptability rather than rigid formations. Aramean kings invested in military infrastructure not only to defend their cities, but to project power outward. Campaigns against neighbouring states, whether Israel, Hamath, or smaller Aramean rivals, required organised armies capable of conducting sieges and field battles. The biblical accounts of wars between Israel and Damascus describe chariots, cavalry, and large armies engaging in protracted struggles over control of territories. These narratives, though shaped by theological and political agendas, nonetheless reflect the reality that Damascus in particular could field forces that rivaled its neighbours and threatened the stability of the region. Fortifications became symbols of authority as well as instruments of defence. The ability of a king to build strong walls demonstrated both his resources and his legitimacy. Temples and palaces within these fortified towns reinforced the connection between military power, divine favour, and political rule. Reliefs and inscriptions from Aramean sites show kings depicted as warriors, armed with bows or spears, emphasizing their role as protectors of the people. Military leadership was not simply a practical necessity, but a central component of royal ideology. The Assyrian annals describing their wars against Aramean states provide valuable insights into Aramean military strategy. Repeatedly, Assyrian kings complain of the difficulty of bringing them to battle, noting how they retreated into the desert or into fortified towns when confronted with overwhelming force. This dual strategy of mobility and defence reflects the adaptability of Aramean rulers. They could not hope to match the vast armies of Assyria in open battle, but they could wear them down with raids, force them into costly sieges, and regroup once the imperial army withdrew. This strategy delayed Assyrian conquest for centuries and allowed Aramean kingdoms to maintain independence long after other states had fallen. The coalition warfare exemplified by the Battle of Karkar demonstrates another aspect of Aramean military practice: diplomacy as a tool of defence. Damascus and its allies recognized that survival against Assyria required cooperation. By combining their forces with those of Phoenicians, Israelites and others, they created an army large enough to challenge the imperial advance. Though ultimately unable to halt Assyrian expansion forever, these coalitions show the strategic sophistication of Aramean rulers, who understood that warfare was as much about alliances and timing as about numbers and weapons. Naval power played little role in Aramean warfare, given their inland location, but their control of trade routes linking the interior with the coast gave them leverage in maritime commerce. Caravans carrying goods to Phoenician ports depended on Aramean protection, or at least tolerance, giving rulers the ability to influence trade without ships of their own. This control of overland trade routes was itself a form of strategic warfare, for by taxing or disrupting caravans, Aramean kings could enrich themselves and weaken their enemies. The psychological aspect of Aramean military culture should also be considered. For a people who had once lived as nomads, warfare was not merely a matter of defence but a way of life, bound up with honour, survival and prestige. Oral traditions likely celebrated heroic warriors, victories in raids, and the resilience of tribes against powerful enemies. Even as they settled into kingdoms, this ethos persisted, shaping how they fought and how they saw themselves. The ability to resist Assyria for centuries despite overwhelming odds speaks to a cultural identity rooted in defiance and endurance. Fortifications, however, could not always save them. When Assyrian kings such as Tiglath-Pileser III, Shalmaneser I, and Sargon II launched systematic campaigns, the walls of Aramean cities eventually fell. The accounts of these sieges preserved in Assyrian inscriptions describe battering rams, siege towers and mass deportations. Yet the very fact that such elaborate operations were required demonstrates the strength of Aramean defences. These cities did not collapse easily. They demanded the full might of the empire to subdue them. The legacy of Aramean military practice extended beyond their own time. As deported populations spread across Mesopotamia, their soldiers and leaders carried with them knowledge of fortification and strategy. Aramaic mercenaries later served in Assyrian, Babylonian, and Persian armies, contributing their skills to the military traditions of the Near East. The adaptability that had defined them as nomads and settlers alike now allowed them to function as soldiers in the service of foreign kings. The study of Aramean warfare thus reveals a people who combined the agility of the steppe with the solidity of the city. They fought with speed when mobility was possible, and with stubborn defence when confronted with overwhelming power. They built walls that stood for generations and armies that could both raid and resist. Their kings were warriors as well as rulers. Their towns were fortresses as well as markets, and their survival depended on the balance between attack, defence and diplomacy. In these strategies lay the key to their endurance, allowing them to hold their ground until the full weight of Assyrian imperial power could no longer be resisted. This approach to warfare also prepared them for the next stage of their history, when the focus would shift from individual kingdoms to the broader role they played in trade and commerce across the Near East. For as much as they fought, they also traded, and their influence spread not only through arms and fortifications, but also through caravans, markets, and the language that carried transactions across empires. The rise of the Aramean kingdoms was not only measured in wars, fortifications and sieges, but also in their growing role as intermediaries of trade and commerce across the Near East. Their homelands, scattered across Syria, the upper Mesopotamian plain, and parts of the Levant, were situated at the crossroads of some of the most important trade routes in the ancient world. For centuries before their emergence, caravans had moved along the Euphrates corridor, across the Syrian steppe, and through the passes of the Levant, connecting the resources of Mesopotamia with the coastal cities of Phoenicia, the markets of Anatolia, and the distant lands of Arabia and Egypt. The Arameans, with their background as mobile pastoralists and their new identity as rulers of fortified towns, were uniquely positioned to dominate these routes. The earlier stages of their involvement in commerce likely began while they were still semi-nomadic. Pastoral groups had always participated in exchange, offering wool, hides, and livestock in return for grain, tools, and luxury goods. Their mobility gave them access to remote regions and allowed them to move goods between settled zones. When they began to settle in more permanent towns, they did not abandon this heritage but built upon it, institutionalizing caravan trade as a central component of their political economy. In many ways, their ability to control and profit from long-distance commerce was as important to their survival as their fortifications or their armies. Geography favoured them. The Euphrates River, flowing from Anatolia through Syria into Mesopotamia, served as a natural artery of communication. Towns such as Tel Barsip, capital of Bitadini, sat at strategic crossing points where river and land routes intersected. Control of these points meant control of the flow of goods and the ability to tax caravans. Farther west, kingdoms such as Bitagusi near Aleppo and Aram Damascus near the Ghouta plain dominated overland routes leading to Phoenician ports. From Damascus, traders could move southward toward the Red Sea and Arabia, eastward toward Mesopotamia, and westward toward the Mediterranean. Few cities in the ancient Near East were better positioned to serve as a hub of caravan commerce. The goods that flowed along these routes were diverse. From Anatolia came metals such as copper, tin, and later iron, essential for tools and weapons. From Phoenicia came timber, glass, and purple dye, coveted across the Mediterranean. From Mesopotamia came textiles, grain, and luxury items. From Arabia came incense, spices, and precious stones, transported by long camel caravans through the deserts. The Arameans, positioned at the crossroads, facilitated these exchanges, taxing them, protecting them, and sometimes monopolizing them. The wealth that accrued from such commerce helped finance their palaces, temples, and armies, giving them the resources to stand against powerful empires. The camel played a decisive role in this transformation. Though domesticated earlier, its widespread use in caravan trade accelerated in the early first millennium. Unlike donkeys or oxen, camels could endure long journeys without water, carry heavy loads, and traverse deserts that were otherwise impassable. The Arameans, with their pastoral heritage, were among the peoples who mastered the use of camels in long-distance trade. Caravans of camels laden with incense, spices, and textiles became the lifeblood of commerce across Syria and Mesopotamia. By controlling caravan routes, Aramean rulers not only enriched themselves, but also shaped the economic geography of the Near East. Aramean involvement in commerce was not limited to collecting tolls or offering protection. They also became active participants in the trade itself. Archaeological finds from Aramean sites reveal imported goods, Phoenician luxury items, Mesopotamian ceramics, Anatolian metals, showing that their elites consumed and displayed products from far-flung regions. Such items were not only economic assets, but symbols of status and legitimacy. By surrounding themselves with foreign goods, Aramean kings projected an image of cosmopolitan power, connecting their kingdoms to the wider world. The role of Damascus in particular as a commercial hub cannot be overstated. Its fertile plains supported abundant agriculture, providing supplies for caravans and surplus for export. Its location allowed it to dominate the flow of goods between Arabia and the northern Levant. Later biblical texts recall Damascus as a city of trade, filled with wealth and merchants. This memory reflects a reality that extended beyond Israelite perceptions. Damascus was a marketplace where cultures and economies intersected, a node in the great network of Near Eastern commerce. The relationship between trade and politics was intimate. Control of caravan routes often determined the rise and fall of kingdoms. Assyrian campaigns against the Arameans frequently targeted strategic towns, not only for their military value, but for their economic significance. To conquer Tilbarsip or Arpad was to seize control of vital crossroads, ensuring access to trade revenues. Conversely, for Aramean rulers, maintaining independence meant maintaining control over these economic arteries. Tribute demanded by Assyrian kings often came in the form of luxury goods and metals acquired through trade, underscoring how commerce sustained both resistance and submission. Caravan trade also had a cultural dimension. Along with goods travelled ideas, artistic styles, and languages. The spread of Aramaic as a lingua franca was closely tied to its role in commerce. Merchants needed a practical, accessible language to conduct business across diverse populations. Aramaic, with its alphabetic script and simplicity compared to cuneiform, filled this need. As Aramean merchants moved along trade routes, they carried their language with them. Over time, even empires like Assyria and Persia adopted Aramaic for administration, a development rooted in the practicalities of trade as much as in conquest. The risks of caravan trade were significant, and the Arameans' ability to manage them contributed to their reputation. Bandits, hostile tribes, and imperial armies all threatened the movement of goods. Aramean rulers built reputations as protectors of caravans, offering safe passage in return for tolls. Their knowledge of the terrain and their skill in negotiating with both allies and enemies made them indispensable intermediaries. This protective role was a source of both legitimacy and income, reinforcing their political authority. Religion also intersected with commerce. Temples often played roles in the regulation of trade, providing sanctuaries for merchants, serving as repositories of wealth, and offering divine protection for journeys. In Damascus and other Aramean centres, gods such as Hadad were invoked to bless caravans and ensure safe passage. The intertwining of commerce and religion reinforced the sacred dimension of trade, presenting it not only as an economic necessity but as an activity under divine oversight. The integration of Arameans into regional commerce also transformed their society. As wealth from trade flowed into their cities, social hierarchies became more pronounced. Aristocracies of merchants and landowners emerged alongside traditional tribal elites. Palaces decorated with imported goods and temples adorned with foreign offerings reflected the growing wealth gap between elites and commoners. Yet this wealth also enabled cultural flourishing, with art, architecture, and inscriptions displaying influences from across the Near East. The Arameans became not only warriors and herders, but also patrons of culture, supported by the revenues of commerce. The role of the Arameans in commerce extended beyond their independence. Even after the fall of their kingdoms to Assyrian conquest, Aramean merchants continued to dominate trade routes. Deportations scattered them across Mesopotamia, but rather than erasing their influence, this dispersal spread their commercial networks. In Assyrian and later Babylonian and Persian contexts, Aramean traders were ubiquitous, facilitating exchanges across vast territories. Their language, their skills, and their networks outlived their political independence, embedding them in the economic fabric of empires. In retrospect, the Arameans' mastery of trade and caravan commerce was as significant to their legacy as their fortifications or their wars. Their strategic location, their pastoral heritage, and their adaptability allowed them to become the merchants of the Near East, carrying goods, ideas, and language across boundaries. Commerce gave them a form of power that military conquest alone could not provide. the ability to shape the cultural and economic patterns of the region long after their kingdoms had fallen. As their role in trade expanded, so too did the reach of their language and culture, preparing the ground for Aramaic to become the common tongue of the Near East. But before exploring the spread of language, it is necessary to understand more fully how Aramean religious life, closely tied to their political and commercial activities, shaped their identity and their interactions with others. The legacy of the Arameans is most visible not in the ruins of their fortresses or the remnants of their palaces, but in the survival of their language, which rose from the tribal speech of pastoral nomads to become the lingua franca of empires. This transformation was not immediate, nor was it the result of deliberate policy by the Arameans themselves in their early centuries. Instead, it was the product of historical circumstances, commercial necessity, and the adaptability of both the people and their script. By the time the Assyrians, Babylonians, and Persians had stretched their power across the Near East, Aramaic had become the medium through which administration, diplomacy, and trade were conducted, a position it would retain for many centuries. In its earliest form, Aramaic was one of many Semitic dialects spoken in the Fertile Crescent. Closely related to Hebrew, Phoenician, and the older Amorite tongue, it shared a common linguistic heritage with the languages of Mesopotamia and the Levant. To its earliest speakers, it was simply the language of the tribe, carried orally in camps, passed on through kinship networks, and shaped by the needs of pastoral life. Unlike Akkadian, the prestigious language of Mesopotamian scribes and administrators, Aramaic had no vast written tradition in its beginnings. It was practical, spoken, flexible, and rooted in oral transmission. The turning point came with the adoption of an alphabetic script, where Akkadian relied on cuneiform, a complex system of hundreds of wedge-shaped signs requiring years of training to master. Aramaic used a simpler set of alphabetic symbols derived from earlier Northwest Semitic scripts. This alphabet could be learned more quickly, written more easily with ink on papyrus or parchment, and adapted to a wide variety of dialects and contexts. For merchants, administrators, and ordinary people alike, Aramaic script provided an efficient alternative to the cumbersome cuneiform system. In a world where trade routes spanned deserts, mountains, and seas, such efficiency mattered enormously. Commerce provided the first great arena in which Aramaic spread beyond its tribal origins. Aramean merchants, moving along caravan routes between Mesopotamia, Syria, and the Mediterranean, used their own language to conduct business. The alphabetic script allowed them to keep records, contracts, and correspondence with relative ease. As their role in regional trade expanded, so too did the reach of their language. Neighbouring peoples found it useful to adopt Aramaic for communication with merchants, just as centuries later, Greek and then Arabic would spread along the paths of commerce. The political fragmentation of the early Iron Age also created fertile ground for the spread of Aramaic. In the absence of a single dominant empire during the centuries following the Bronze Age collapse, dozens of small kingdoms and tribal groups interacted constantly. Each had its own dialect, traditions, and script. But in this environment of diversity, a simple and adaptable language gained advantages. Aramaic, with its straightforward alphabet and widespread use among traders, increasingly became the medium through which different groups could communicate. Its rise was organic, born not of conquest but of utility. The role of the Assyrian Empire in the next stage of this transformation was decisive. For centuries, Assyrian kings had fought against the Arameans, besieging their cities, deporting their populations, and annexing their lands. Ironically, these very acts contributed to the spread of Aramaic. Deportations scattered Aramean communities across Mesopotamia, transplanting their language into new regions. As these deported peoples settled, they continued to use their language, teaching it to neighbours, intermarrying, and blending into the fabric of local societies. Instead of erasing Aramean culture, Assyrian policy inadvertently spread it. By the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, Assyrian administrators themselves began to adopt Aramaic for practical purposes. Akkadian remained the language of royal inscriptions and ceremonial texts, but for everyday administration, correspondence and interaction with diverse subject peoples, Aramaic was more efficient. Its alphabet was easier to use for rapid writing, and its spread among populations made it a common medium of communication. Bilingual inscriptions from this period, written in both Akkadian and Aramaic, testify to the growing importance of the latter. What had once been the language of pastoral tribes was now being used in the chancelleries of one of the greatest empires of the ancient world. The Babylonians inherited this development when they replaced Assyria as the dominant power in Mesopotamia. In Babylonian times, Aramaic continued to expand, favoured for commerce and administration alike. Documents from this period show that scribes trained in cuneiform also wrote in Aramaic, often using it for contracts, letters, and records intended for practical use rather than for monumental display. The spread of Aramaic was thus not only geographical, but also functional, extending from trade to law, from personal letters to state administration. The most dramatic stage in this process came under the Persian Empire, which stretched from the Aegean to the Indus and encompassed dozens of languages and cultures. The Achaemenid kings, recognizing the need for a common medium of administration, adopted Imperial Aramaic as their official language of communication. From the royal court at Persepolis to provincial governors in Egypt, Aramaic became the standardized script for decrees, correspondence, and records. The Dead Sea Scrolls, centuries later, would still be written in forms of Aramaic descended from this imperial usage. The elevation of Aramaic to the status of imperial lingua franca was a culmination of centuries of organic spread, now reinforced by deliberate state policy. The adaptability of Aramaic lay at the heart of its success. Its alphabet could be modified to suit different dialects and contexts, spawning regional variations without losing intelligibility. Its simplicity allowed it to be taught and learned quickly, breaking down barriers of literacy that had long protected the elite monopoly on writing. Its flexibility made it equally useful for traders, farmers, priests, and kings. In a world of constant interaction, Aramaic provided a common thread, weaving together the diverse peoples of the Near East. Religious traditions also contributed to the prestige of Aramaic. Parts of the Hebrew Bible, particularly the books of Daniel and Ezra, were written in Aramaic, reflecting the language's dominance in Jewish communities during and after the Babylonian exile. Prayers, commentaries, and later the Targums, which translated Hebrew scriptures into Aramaic, demonstrate its role in shaping religious life. In Christian tradition, Aramaic was the language spoken by Jesus of Nazareth and his earliest followers, embedding it forever in the memory of world religions. These later developments underscore the enduring legacy of a language that began as the tribal speech of wandering herders. The spread of Aramaic also reveals the interplay between language and identity. While political independence of the Aramean kingdoms faded under Assyrian conquest, their language survived and flourished, outlasting the empires that had sought to suppress them. In this sense, the triumph of Aramaic was the triumph of cultural resilience. Even without a unified Aramean state, their language became the glue of the Near East, a living symbol of their influence. Aramaic inscriptions from the early kingdoms of Damascus, Bit Adini, and Bit Agusi show the transition from tribal identity to urban statehood. Later Aramaic papyri from Egypt, such as those found at Elephantine, reveal the spread of the language into distant lands, carried by mercenaries, traders, and administrators. From the Euphrates to the Nile, from Anatolia to Persia, Aramaic left its mark. Its role as lingua franca demonstrates how deeply the Arameans had embedded themselves in the networks of communication and exchange. The rise of Aramaic as an imperial language did not mean the disappearance of other tongues. Akkadian persisted in scholarly contexts, Hebrew in religious life, Phoenician in maritime commerce, and local dialects in daily speech. Yet Aramaic provided a bridge among them. a shared medium that facilitated interaction. In this sense, it prefigured later global languages such as Greek, Latin, or Arabic, which served as common tongues across vast and diverse regions. The story of Aramaic anticipates these later developments, showing how practical necessity and cultural adaptability can elevate a language from obscurity to dominance. In the long arc of Near Eastern history, the ascendancy of Aramaic as a lingua franca was one of the most transformative developments. It reshaped administration, facilitated commerce, influenced religion, and preserved the legacy of a people whose political power had been eclipsed, but whose cultural impact endured. From the tribal speech of nomads, it became the language of empires, a journey that encapsulates the broader trajectory of the Arameans themselves. And as their language carried across the world of empires, their religious practices too travelled, adapting to new contexts and blending with local traditions. The next stage of the story leads naturally into the realm of their gods, rituals and cults, where the Arameans' identity expressed itself not only through words but through offerings, festivals and sacred places that bridged their tribal past and their urban present. Religion among the Arameans was never a fixed or uniform system, but a living set of practices shaped by their tribal origins, their migrations, their encounters with great empires, and their eventual settlement in urban kingdoms. To understand their religious life is to see how a people without a central temple tradition like Mesopotamia's ziggurats or Egypt's monumental cult centres nonetheless created a religious identity that was both flexible and enduring. The gods they worshipped, the rituals they performed, and the sanctuaries they built reveal not only their own beliefs, but also their ability to absorb and reinterpret the traditions of others, weaving them into a fabric that was distinctly Aramean, yet connected to the wider Near Eastern world. In their earliest phases as nomads of the steppe, the Arameans likely practiced a form of religion centred on clan deities, natural forces and ancestral spirits. The mobility of pastoral life did not permit the construction of permanent temples or the maintenance of elaborate priesthoods. Instead, worship would have been portable, marked by altars of stone, sacred groves, or standing pillars erected in open landscapes. Such practices echo the broader Semitic traditions visible in the religious life of the Amorites, Israelites, and other related peoples. The storm, the desert wind, the fertility of pastures, and the cycles of rain would naturally have been associated with divine powers. Deities were protectors of kin groups, invoked for success in herding, raiding, and survival. As they settled into fortified towns and established kingdoms, their religious practices changed. The gods of the steppe were given temples, and their cults became institutionalized. Among these deities, Hadad, the storm god, emerged as the most prominent. Often represented with thunderbolts in hand, standing atop a bull, Hadad was associated with rain, fertility, and kingship. His prominence reflects both the agricultural needs of settled Aramean societies and the broader importance of storm gods throughout the Levant. Kings of Damascus, for example, frequently took the theophoric title Ben-Hadad, son of Hadad, emphasizing their legitimacy as chosen rulers under the protection of this powerful deity. Hadad was not the only god venerated. The moon god Sin, the sun god Shamash, and local forms of the goddess Ishtar or Astarte appear in inscriptions and cultic contexts, reflecting the influence of Mesopotamian and Canaanite traditions. Local variants of deities were common, each kingdom adapting and fusing divine names according to its traditions and interactions. In Arpad, in Hamath, and in Damascus, the divine pantheon bore different emphases, yet shared common traits. This diversity reveals a religious landscape that was regional rather than centralized, reflecting the fragmented political structure of the Aramean world. The temples built in Aramean kingdoms were often modest compared to the monumental architecture of Assyria or Babylon, but they nonetheless served as centers of community life and symbols of political legitimacy. Archaeological remains at sites such as Tel Halaf suggest sanctuaries adorned with statues, reliefs and offerings. Stone orthostats from Aramean palaces depict gods, mythical creatures, and ritual scenes, providing glimpses into their cosmology. The artistic style blends Mesopotamian, Hittite and local influences, testifying to the cultural fusion inherent in Aramean religion. Ritual practices likely included sacrifices of animals, libations of wine or oil, and the dedication of votive offerings. Inscriptions from Aramaic contexts mention vows made to gods, promises fulfilled with offerings, and prayers for protection. Kings and elites would have sponsored large-scale rituals, reinforcing their role as mediators between the divine and the community. Festivals tied to agricultural cycles, planting, harvest, and the arrival of seasonal rains would have been accompanied by ceremonies invoking Hadad's favour. For ordinary people, daily offerings at household shrines or local sanctuaries maintained the presence of the gods in everyday life. One of the defining features of Aramean religion was its openness to external influences. As they interacted with Mesopotamian empires, they adopted elements of Assyrian and Babylonian religion, incorporating deities like Marduk or adapting Mesopotamian iconography into their own art. From the Canaanite and Phoenician world, they absorbed cults of fertility goddesses and solar deities. From northern traditions, they inherited Hittite and Hurrian motifs, evident in the hybrid creatures carved into their palaces. Rather than seeing this as dilution, it should be understood as a creative process of fusion, in which the Arameans integrated surrounding traditions into their own framework. This adaptability made their religion resilient and helped it endure across diverse contexts. The role of kingship in Aramean religion is particularly significant. Kings were not divine figures as in Egypt, but they were seen as chosen by the gods and protected by them. Royal inscriptions often begin with invocations of Hadad or other deities, situating the ruler's authority within a sacred context. The king as warrior, builder and protector was understood as fulfilling divine mandate. Defeat in battle could be interpreted as divine punishment, while victory was proof of divine favour. This intertwining of religion and politics strengthened the legitimacy of Aramean monarchies and bound the community together under shared cultic life. The integration of religion into diplomacy is also evident. Treaties between Aramean states and their neighbours often invoked deities as witnesses and guarantors. Oaths were sworn before the gods, with curses pronounced on those who broke agreements. This practice, common throughout the Near East, reveals the seriousness with which divine authority was understood in political affairs. The gods of Aram stood alongside those of Assyria, Israel or Phoenicia as equal arbiters of human contracts, reinforcing the sense of shared sacred order across cultural boundaries. Biblical references to the Arameans shed additional light on their religious life. Accounts of conflicts between Israel and Damascus often mention the gods of the Arameans, sometimes contrasting them with the God of Israel. These texts reflect both rivalry and recognition, rivalry in the sense of polemics against foreign gods, and recognition in the sense that Aramean religion was understood to be powerful and influential. The persistence of names like Ben-Hadad in the biblical narrative underscores how deeply the identity of Damascus was tied to its divine protector. Over time, Aramean religious practices continue to evolve under imperial domination. When Assyria conquered Aramean cities, their temples were often appropriated, their gods identified with Assyrian deities, and their rituals integrated into imperial cult. Yet even under such pressure, Aramean religion retained distinct features. Local cults persisted, household worship continued, and the names of Aramean gods remained in inscriptions and personal names. This resilience mirrors the broader pattern of Aramean culture, politically conquered, yet culturally influential. The eventual spread of Aramaic as a lingua franca also carried with it elements of Aramean religion. Religious terms, divine names, and ritual expressions embedded in the language travelled far beyond the original homelands. Aramaic prayers, formulas, and vocabulary entered the religious traditions of Jews, Christians, and later groups across the Near East. In this way, the gods of the Arameans, though transformed and reinterpreted, continued to echo in the sacred speech of later generations. The fusion of Aramean religion with local traditions is perhaps its most enduring trait. By blending storm god worship with fertility cults, by adapting Mesopotamian deities into their pantheon, by integrating Canaanite and Phoenician influences, the Arameans created a religious system that was both particular and universal. It allowed them to maintain identity while engaging with others, to be distinct yet connected. This quality not only sustained them in their own time, but prepared the ground for their religious legacy to outlast their political power. In considering their religious practices, one sees reflected the broader themes of Aramean history: mobility giving way to settlement, tribal identity merging with urban culture, resilience under imperial pressure, and adaptability in the face of diversity. Their gods, their rituals, and their temples tell the story of a people who wove together many strands into a single fabric, one that would continue to influence the religious and cultural life of the Near East long after their kingdoms had disappeared. And as their deities stood at the centre of their rituals, so too did their interactions with neighbouring peoples shape the course of their religious and political life. The next stage of the story turns naturally to their encounters with Israel, where conflict, alliance, and cultural exchange intertwined, leaving a complex legacy recorded not only in inscriptions, but in the biblical narratives that preserve echoes of centuries of interaction. The story of the Arameans cannot be told without also speaking of their interactions with Israel. For centuries, the two peoples were neighbours, rivals, and at times uneasy allies. Their proximity meant that they contested the same lands, drew upon the same trade networks, and influenced one another's politics, language, and religion. While Assyrian and Babylonian inscriptions preserve the external perspective on Aramean power, the Hebrew Bible provides another set of sources that, though written from a specific point of view, offer invaluable insights into how the Arameans and Israelites viewed each other. What emerges from these accounts is a history marked by conflict and bloodshed, but also by exchange and entanglement. Geography played an important role in shaping their relationship. The kingdom of Aram Damascus lay just to the northeast of Israel, with the fertile Ghouta plain giving Damascus resources and strategic depth. Control of the Golan Heights, the Transjordanian Plateau, and the trade routes that ran southward through these regions became points of constant contention. Israel, seeking security for its northern frontier, and Damascus, looking to expand or defend its sphere of influence, clashed repeatedly over these borderlands. Biblical texts preserve the memory of these struggles, describing raids, battles, and shifting alliances that defined the 9th and 8th centuries before the Common Era. The figure of Ben-Hadad, king of Damascus, looms large in the biblical narrative. Accounts in the books of Kings describe wars between him and the kings of Israel, particularly Ahab and later Jehoram. These stories depict sieges of Samaria, battles fought in the valleys of northern Israel, and episodes of temporary peace sealed by treaties. The biblical authors, writing with the theological lens of covenantal history, interpreted these events in terms of divine punishment and deliverance. But beneath the theological framework lies the historical reality of sustained conflict between Israel and Aram Damascus. The very frequency with which these encounters appear in the narrative underscores how central they were to Israel's political life. Yet the relationship was not exclusively hostile. At times, Israel and Damascus found common cause against Assyria, the looming power that threatened both. The coalition at the Battle of Karkar in 853 BCE, where Ahab of Israel and Ben-Hadad of Damascus fought side by side against Shalmaneser III, illustrates this pragmatic alliance. Though their interests often clashed, the shared danger of Assyrian domination could bring them together. This pattern of alternating enmity and cooperation reflects the fluid political realities of the Levant, where survival required both rivalry and diplomacy. Cultural exchange accompanied these political interactions. As neighbouring Semitic peoples, the Israelites and Arameans shared linguistic affinities, making communication relatively easy. The Hebrew language and Aramaic were close relatives, and over time Aramaic words and expressions entered Hebrew, while Israelite traditions absorbed Aramean influences. Later biblical texts even record episodes in which Aramaic served as the medium of diplomacy, highlighting its growing prominence as a language of communication between the two peoples. By the post-exilic period, Aramaic had become the common tongue of Jewish communities, a development rooted in these centuries of contact. Marriage alliances also link the two peoples. Biblical texts recall connections between Israelite kings and Aramean princesses, relationships that reinforce political treaties but also introduced cultural and religious influences. Such alliances could bring tensions as foreign cults entered Israel, provoking opposition from prophets and reformers. Yet they also demonstrate the permeability of boundaries, the way in which politics, kinship, and religion intertwined across ethnic lines. Religious interactions were complex. The cult of Hadad in Damascus, for instance, finds echoes in biblical polemics against Baal worship, suggesting that Israelite prophets perceived the religious influence of their neighbours as a significant threat. At the same time, Israelite religion and Aramean religion shared many traits: devotion to storm deities, veneration of ancestral traditions, and the use of sacred high places for worship. The boundary between shared Semitic heritage and distinct national cults was porous, and cultural borrowing flowed in both directions. The political rivalry reached its peak in the 8th century, during the reign of Hazael, one of the most powerful kings of Damascus. Both Assyrian inscriptions and biblical accounts record his campaigns against Israel and Judah. Hazael expanded the territory of Aram Damascus, inflicted heavy defeats on Israel, and even threatened Jerusalem. His reign represents the height of Damascus's power, and from the perspective of Israelite scribes, he was a formidable adversary who could not be ignored. Archaeological evidence, such as the Tel Dan stele, likely erected by Hazael or one of his successors, provides independent confirmation of Aramean victories over Israel and Judah, naming kings of the House of David as defeated enemies. This inscription offers a rare glimpse of Aramean self-perception, celebrating their triumphs in the same monumental style used by Assyrian kings. The memory of these conflicts shaped Israelite identity. Prophets such as Elisha are depicted as intervening in wars with Damascus, offering divine guidance and proclaiming judgment against Aramean rulers. These narratives reinforced the theological lesson that Israel's fate depended on faithfulness to its God, yet they also reflect the very real geopolitical pressure exerted by Damascus. For generations, Israelite kings had to contend with the power of Aram, adjusting their policies and strategies in response to its strength. The fall of Damascus to Tiglath-Pileser III in 732 BCE marked a turning point not only for the Arameans but also for Israel. With their northern rival subdued and incorporated into the Assyrian Empire, Israel briefly gained relief from Aramean pressure, only to face the Assyrians directly in the years that followed. The shared experience of being conquered by Assyria bound the destinies of Israel and Aram together, as both peoples experienced deportations, loss of independence, and the challenge of preserving identity under imperial rule. Even after the fall of Damascus, cultural exchange continued. Aramaic increasingly became the language of daily life in Israelite and later Jewish communities, gradually supplanting Hebrew as the spoken tongue. By the time of the Babylonian exile, Jewish scribes wrote portions of their scriptures in Aramaic, and by the time of the Second Temple period, prayers, teachings, and interpretations were often delivered in Aramaic. The language of Israel's old rival became the language of its own religious life, a transformation that speaks to the depth of cultural entanglement. The interactions between Arameans and Israelites demonstrate the complexity of ancient Near Eastern politics. They were enemies and allies, competitors and kin, rivals on the battlefield and partners in trade. Their conflicts shaped the geopolitics of the Levant, while their exchanges shaped its culture. The memory of their encounters lives on not only in inscriptions and ruins, but in the very language and religion of later generations. And as Israel's scribes recorded their struggles with Damascus, the Assyrian annals also chronicled the relentless wars between empire and Aramean states. To understand the broader fate of the Arameans, the story now turns from their relations with Israel to their long and often desperate struggle against Assyrian domination, a contest that would determine not only their political survival, but the legacy they would leave within the Near Eastern world. The relationship between the Arameans and the Assyrian Empire had always been uneasy, marked by raids, counter-raids, and shifting balances of power. But with the rise of the Neo-Assyrian Empire in the 9th and 8th centuries before the Common Era, the scale and intensity of this struggle deepened. What had begun as a contest between tribal confederations and early imperial campaigns now became a prolonged confrontation between fully developed Aramean kingdoms and the most aggressive empire the Near East had yet seen. For the Arameans, this era was both the height of their visibility and the beginning of their political decline. The Assyrian kings of the early Neo-Assyrian period were determined to reassert the dominance that earlier generations had lost. Ashurnasirpal II, who reigned from 883 to 859 BCE, inaugurated an era of systematic expansion. His campaigns extended deep into Syria, targeting not only rebellious tribes, but the fortified towns and emerging states of the Arameans. The annals inscribed on palace walls in Nimrud boast of sieges, the capture of cities, and the deportation of populations. In these accounts, Aramean towns like Bitzamani, Guzana, and others appear as stubborn centres of resistance, repeatedly subdued but never fully extinguished. The rhetoric of Ashurnasirpal emphasises terror as a tool of domination, flaying captives, impaling rebels, and carrying away thousands into exile. Yet behind this propaganda lies the recognition that the Arameans posed a recurring obstacle that required persistent campaigns. His successor, Shalmaneser III, continued and intensified the assault. Shalmaneser's reign is particularly well documented, with inscriptions and monuments describing dozens of campaigns into the Levant. Among these, the Battle of Karkar in 853 BCE stands out as a landmark moment in the history of the Aramean struggle. There, Hadadezer of Damascus led a coalition of Levantine states, including Ahab of Israel and allies from Hamath and Phoenicia, to resist Assyrian encroachment. Although Shalmaneser claimed victory, the outcome was ambiguous enough that Damascus and its allies continued to resist for years afterward. The very formation of such a coalition, with Aram Damascus at its head, demonstrates the central role of the Arameans in organising regional resistance to Assyrian domination. Throughout Shalmaneser's long reign, Damascus remained a principal adversary. Campaign after campaign targeted its territory, with the Assyrian annals listing tribute, sieges, and battles. Yet despite the ferocity of these efforts, Damascus maintained its independence for decades, holding the line against the empire. This resilience underscores both the strength of the city's fortifications and the determination of its rulers, who understood that their survival depended on resisting incorporation into Assyrian administration. The reign of Hazael of Damascus in the mid-9th century represents a high point of Aramean defiance. Both Assyrian inscriptions and biblical text portray him as a formidable king who expanded Damascus's territory at the expense of Israel and threatened other neighbours. Shalmaneser III campaigned repeatedly against him, besieging Damascus but never capturing it. The Tel Dan Stele, likely erected by Hazael or one of his successors, commemorates victories over Israel and Judah, presenting the Aramean king as a conqueror in his own right. This period illustrates the capacity of Damascus not only to resist Assyria, but to project power regionally, carving out a sphere of influence that rivaled that of the empire itself. Despite these successes, the relentless pressure of Assyria eventually began to erode Aramean strength. In the 8th century, new kings such as Adad-nirari III and Tiglath-Pileser III renewed campaigns with increasing intensity. The Assyrian military machine had by then evolved into a highly organised force, equipped with siege engines, iron weaponry, and disciplined infantry and cavalry. These campaigns were not isolated raids, but systematic efforts to dismantle the political autonomy of subject states. Damascus, Arpad, and other Aramean strongholds became prime targets in this imperial strategy. Arpad, capital of Bitagusi, provides a vivid example. In the mid-8th century, it became the centre of resistance against Assyria, allying with neighbouring states to resist Tiglath-Pileser III. The Assyrian king responded with a prolonged siege, lasting several years. Inscriptions describe how Arpad was surrounded, starved, and ultimately destroyed, its population deported en masse. The fall of Arpad sent shockwaves through the region, signalling the fate that awaited other Aramean kingdoms. Yet the length of the siege also testifies to the resilience of Aramean defences, which required extraordinary effort to overcome. Damascus itself eventually succumbed in 732 BCE after decades of resistance. Tiglath-Pileser III launched a decisive campaign, besieging the city, capturing it, and executing its king Rezin. The population was deported, and Damascus was incorporated as an Assyrian province. This marked the end of Aram Damascus as an independent power, a turning point that symbolised the collapse of Aramean political autonomy. From then on, the Arameans would exist within the frameworks of empires, their kingdoms dismantled, their rulers replaced by Assyrian governors. The Assyrian strategy of mass deportation played a crucial role in this process. By uprooting entire populations and resettling them in distant regions, the empire not only weakened local resistance but also spread Aramean communities across Mesopotamia. Ironically, this dispersal contributed to the diffusion of Aramaic language and culture. While the political structures of the Arameans were destroyed, their cultural influence was magnified, as deported communities carried their traditions into the heart of the empire. Other Aramean kingdoms, such as Hamath and Guzana, met similar fates. Some submitted early, paying tribute and accepting Assyrian overlordship. Others resisted and suffered destruction. In every case, the result was the same: the gradual absorption of Aramean political units into the expanding empire. Yet the persistence of Aramean names, language, and customs within Assyrian records reveals that conquest did not erase identity. Instead, it transformed it, embedding Aramean culture within the broader imperial mosaic. The long struggle against Neo-Assyrian domination left deep scars, but also lasting legacies. For the Arameans, it was an era of both pride and loss. Pride in the resilience of cities like Damascus and Arpad, which resisted for generations, and loss in the eventual collapse of their independence. For Assyria, the conquest of the Arameans was both a triumph and a challenge, requiring immense resources to subdue peoples who never accepted domination easily. For the Near East as a whole, the outcome reshaped the map, erasing the patchwork of small kingdoms and replacing them with imperial provinces. The memory of this struggle persisted in multiple traditions. Assyrian annals boast of victories portraying Aramean kings as rebels crushed under imperial might. Biblical narratives recall the conflicts with Damascus, framing them as part of Israel's history of divine testing. Aramean inscriptions, though fewer, preserve moments of triumph, celebrating victories over Israel and asserting their own legitimacy. Together, these sources reveal the multi-layered nature of the struggle, seen differently from each perspective but united in acknowledging its intensity. Yet even as their kingdoms fell, the Arameans continued to influence the world around them. Their language became the tool of imperial administration. Their merchants continued to ply the caravan routes. Their deities and rituals, adapted and transformed, lived on in local cults. In this sense, the Arameans endured beyond their political defeat, shaping the very empires that had conquered them. The story of their resistance to Assyria naturally leads to the next phase of their history, when, after the collapse of Damascus and the annexation of their states, they found themselves living under successive foreign rulers, from the Babylonians to the Persians, adapting once more to survive in new imperial systems where their identity was expressed less in kings and cities and more in language, religion, and cultural resilience. By the middle of the 8th century, before the Common Era, the balance of power in the Near East had shifted decisively. The Neo-Assyrian Empire had consolidated its military machine, refined its methods of conquest, and turned its gaze once more toward the western lands of Syria and the Levant. For the Arameans, who had spent generations resisting Assyrian domination, the reign of Tiglath-Pileser III marked the beginning of the end of their political independence. His campaigns were relentless, his policies systematic, and his successors followed the same path, ensuring that by the close of the 8th century, the Aramean kingdoms that had once flourished as independent states were reduced to provinces under imperial rule. Tiglath-Pileser III ascended the throne of Assyria in 745 BCE and immediately embarked on reforms that strengthened the empire's military and administrative capacity. He reorganized the army into a standing force with specialized divisions of cavalry, infantry, and siege engines, making it more effective than ever before. He also introduced a new system of provinces, ensuring that conquered territories were not left as vassal states with local rulers, but were directly administered by Assyrian officials. This shift in policy was devastating for the Arameans, whose earlier survival had depended on the gaps and weaknesses in Assyrian control. The Aramean kingdoms, particularly Damascus, had long stood as bulwarks of resistance. Yet Tiglath-Pileser targeted them with a calculated strategy designed not merely to punish, but to eliminate their independence altogether. His inscriptions describe campaigns against Arpad, the capital of Bitagusi, which had become a rallying point for anti-Assyrian resistance. The siege of Arpad lasted for years, demonstrating both the strength of Aramean defences and the determination of Assyria to break them. When the city finally fell around 740 BCE, the consequences were catastrophic. The population was deported, the walls dismantled, and the territory transformed into an Assyrian province. The fall of Arpad sent a clear message to the rest of Syria that resistance was futile, for even the strongest Aramean fortress could not withstand Assyrian might forever. Damascus remained the greatest prize. Under King Rezin, it continued to assert independence, even forming alliances with Israel and other states in attempts to stave off imperial conquest. Biblical texts recall the Syro-Ephraimite War, in which Rezin and Pekah of Israel sought to compel Judah to join their coalition against Assyria. But Tiglath-Pileser responded with overwhelming force. His campaign in 732 BCE besieged Damascus, captured it, and executed Rezin. The city was stripped of its autonomy, its elite deported, and its lands incorporated into the Assyrian provincial system. With this decisive blow, the last major Aramean kingdom ceased to exist as an independent state. Other Aramean polities fell in rapid succession. Bit Zamani, Bit Adini, Hamath, and numerous smaller states were absorbed into the expanding empire. Some rulers attempted to save themselves by paying tribute or submitting early, but such gestures only delayed the inevitable. The Assyrian strategy under Tiglath-Pileser and his successors was comprehensive. Resistance was crushed through siege and deportation. Submission was rewarded with temporary leniency, but in all cases independence was stripped away and replaced by direct imperial control. The consequences for the Aramean political order were profound. For centuries their strength had lain in their fragmentation, in the resilience of many small kingdoms that could survive even if one or two were destroyed. But Assyrian policy of systematic annexation and mass deportation destroyed this network. The removal of populations from their homelands disrupted the tribal and kinship structures on which Aramean politics had been built. Entire communities were transplanted into distant regions of Mesopotamia, severing them from their ancestral lands and weakening the basis of their political identity. Yet in cultural terms, this dispersal had the paradoxical effect of strengthening the influence of the Arameans. As deported populations resettled in Mesopotamian cities, they carried with them their language, customs, and traditions. Aramaic, already spreading through trade and diplomacy, now became even more widespread, used not only in Syria and the Levant but throughout Assyrian provinces. Imperial administrators, recognizing its utility, adopted it alongside Akkadian for record-keeping and communication. Thus, even as Aramean kingship was extinguished, Aramean culture seeped into the very heart of the empire. The successors of Tiglath-Pileser continued his policies. Shalmaneser V, Sargon II, and Sennacherib all oversaw campaigns in the west, ensuring that no trace of independent Aramean power remained. Sargon's inscriptions describe the conquest of Hamath and the deportation of its population after a rebellion, illustrating that even decades after Tiglath-Pileser's campaigns, resistance still flickered but was met with swift and brutal suppression. Sennacherib, more famous for his wars against Babylon and Judah, nonetheless maintained tight control over Syria, ensuring that Aramean territories remained firmly within the imperial structure. The destruction of Aramean political independence also altered the geopolitical landscape of the Levant. With Damascus and other kingdoms gone, the only remaining independent powers were the smaller states of Israel and Judah, the Phoenician cities, and Egypt on the southern horizon. But the absence of strong Aramean states left these smaller powers more exposed, forcing them to deal directly with Assyria without the buffer of Damascus. In this sense, the fall of the Arameans not only ended their own independence, but reshaped the fate of their neighbours as well. Despite the harshness of conquest, traces of Aramean identity persisted. Personal names of Aramean origin appear in Assyrian records, suggesting that individuals rose to prominence within the imperial system. Some Arameans served as soldiers, scribes, and administrators in Assyrian service, adapting to new roles while preserving elements of their heritage. Temples to Hadad and other deities continue to exist, though often subordinated to Assyrian cults. The fusion of religious traditions reflects the broader process of cultural absorption and transformation that followed political conquest. From the perspective of the Assyrian kings, the conquest of the Arameans was both a triumph and a necessity. Their inscriptions boast of crushing rebellions, burning cities, and deporting populations. Yet the very attention given to these campaigns demonstrates how persistent the Arameans had been as adversaries. For centuries they had resisted, delayed, and frustrated Assyrian expansion. Their final defeat under Tiglath-Pileser and his successors represented the culmination of a struggle that had shaped the history of the Near East since the 12th century. For the Arameans themselves, this period marked the loss of political autonomy, but not of cultural identity. Their kingdoms were gone, their kings executed or exiled, their cities transformed into provincial centres, yet their language thrived, their traditions adapted, and their influence spread. In the paradox of history, conquest extinguished their independence but magnified their cultural reach. The story of their decline under Assyria is thus also the story of how they laid the foundations for their enduring role in the cultural and linguistic history of the region. The decline of their political power under Tiglath-Pileser and his successors naturally leads into the next stage of their existence, when the Arameans, no longer rulers of independent kingdoms, became subjects of successive empires, first Babylonian, then Persian, where their survival would depend not on kings or fortresses, but on their ability to endure as a people through language, religion, and the spread of their traditions across a wider world. The fall of Damascus in 732 BCE and the subsequent collapse of other Aramean strongholds under Tiglath-Pileser III and his successors ended centuries of Aramean independence. Their kingdoms, once scattered across Syria, Mesopotamia and the Levant, were dismantled, their kings executed or exiled, their populations deported. Yet the disappearance of Aramean states from the political map did not mean the disappearance of the Arameans themselves. Their survival in the centuries that followed, under the Neo-Babylonian and later the Persian empires, illustrates one of the most remarkable transformations in ancient Near Eastern history. They ceased to exist as rulers of kingdoms but endured as a people, carried forward by their language, their religion, and their ability to adapt within the frameworks of larger imperial systems. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, established after the fall of Assyria in the late 7th century BCE, inherited territories that had once belonged to Aramean kingdoms. Babylonia had long been familiar with the Arameans, who had raided its lands centuries earlier and settled along its rivers. By the time of Nebuchadnezzar II, the Arameans were not strangers or invaders but part of the fabric of Babylonian society. They were farmers in the countryside, merchants in the markets, soldiers in the army, and scribes in the administration. The Babylonian chronicles, while focused on the great campaigns against Assyria and Judah, reveal the integration of diverse populations among whom the Arameans were prominent. Language played a central role in their continued survival. Aramaic had by this time become the common tongue of much of the Near East, favoured for trade and administration alike. Even in Babylonia, where Akkadian remained the scholarly language of priests and scribes, Aramaic dominated everyday life. Documents written in Aramaic have been discovered across the empire, from clay tablets with bilingual inscriptions to ostraca and papyri recording contracts, letters, and receipts. For ordinary people, including those of Aramean descent, this meant that their language provided continuity across political upheavals. Even when their kings and cities were gone, their speech endured, binding communities together in exile and settlement alike. The dispersal of Aramean populations under Assyrian deportation policies also contributed to this continuity. Communities transplanted to Mesopotamia during the 8th and 7th centuries BCE remained in place under Babylonian rule. Rather than erasing their identity, these deportations had embedded them across the empire, giving them a wide geographic presence. Some were settled as agricultural labourers, others as soldiers or craftsmen, still others as colonists in strategic regions. This distribution of Aramean communities ensured that, even without political autonomy, their cultural presence was too deeply rooted to be undone. The period of Neo-Babylonian rule also saw Arameans living alongside other displaced peoples, including the Israelites exiled from Judah. The shared experience of exile, the use of Aramaic as a common language, and the overlapping religious traditions created a milieu in which cultural exchange was inevitable. Biblical texts composed during and after the exile reflect this environment, where Aramaic words and expressions entered Hebrew, and where the experience of living under Babylonian authority was mediated through a linguistic and cultural framework deeply influenced by the Arameans. The Persian conquest of Babylon in 539 BCE introduced a new phase in Aramean survival. The Achaemenid Empire, stretching from the Aegean to the Indus, was the most expansive state the Near East had yet known. Its rulers faced the challenge of governing dozens of languages and cultures across vast distances. Their solution was to adopt Aramaic as the official language of imperial administration. Known as Imperial Aramaic, this standardized form of the language was used for correspondence between the court and provinces, for decrees, and for official documents across the empire. From Egypt to Bactria, Aramaic inscriptions and papyri testify to its role as the lingua franca of the Persian world. This elevation of Aramaic to the status of imperial language was transformative. It meant that the descendants of the Arameans, who no longer ruled kingdoms of their own, nonetheless found their language enshrined at the highest levels of administration. Aramean scribes and officials were in high demand, serving as interpreters, clerks, and record keepers. Communities that had once been marginal tribes were now indispensable participants in the functioning of empire. The paradox of their history is stark. Political defeat had cleared the way for cultural triumph, as their language reached a wider audience than it ever had under their independent kings. The Persian period also allowed for a measure of religious and cultural continuity. Unlike the Assyrians, who often destroyed temples and deported populations, the Persians pursued a policy of relative tolerance, permitting subject peoples to maintain their local traditions. Aramean religious practices, centered on deities like Hadad and Sin, continued in various forms, sometimes syncretized with Persian religious influences. Archaeological evidence from Syria and Mesopotamia suggests that local cults persisted under imperial oversight, adapted to new contexts but not extinguished. In Egypt, Aramean communities left some of the most striking evidence of their survival. At Elephantine, a colony of Aramean and Jewish mercenaries served in the Persian garrison during the 5th century BCE. The Aramaic papyri discovered there provide a vivid window into daily life. Contracts, letters, petitions, and religious texts written in Aramaic. These documents demonstrate not only the widespread use of the language, but also the integration of Aramean traditions into diverse environments. The Elephantine papyri are a reminder that the Arameans, once defined by their tribal and territorial kingdoms, had become a diasporic people whose identity was carried by language and community rather than by borders. The role of Aramaic as a lingua franca during the Persian period also influenced neighbouring cultures profoundly. The Jews returning from Babylonian exile adopted Aramaic for everyday use, and parts of their scriptures were written in it. Inscriptions and administrative documents across the empire reflect the same trend. From royal decrees to humble receipts, Aramaic became the language of record, ensuring that the legacy of the Arameans endured even in contexts far removed from their original homelands. The persistence of Aramean identity under these empires highlights their adaptability. Without kings, armies, or independent cities, they survived through softer but more enduring means: language, trade, religion, and community. They became essential intermediaries in the networks of empire, linking distant provinces with the centre, carrying goods, ideas, and beliefs across regions. Their resilience was not the resilience of fortresses, but of words, customs, and networks, which outlasted the monuments of their conquerors. By the time Alexander the Great marched into the Near East in the 4th century BCE, the Arameans no longer existed as a political force, but their language was spoken everywhere, their traditions woven into the fabric of Near Eastern society. The centuries under Babylonian and Persian rule had not erased them, but transformed them, preparing the way for their influence to persist even under Hellenistic and Roman dominance. The survival of the Arameans under the Neo-Babylonian and Persian empires thus illustrates the paradox of their history, a people who lost everything politically yet gained more than they ever could culturally. From tribal speech to imperial administration, from local cults to diasporic communities, they endured and adapted. Their story now moves forward into the broader consequences of this cultural survival, particularly the spread of Aramaic and Aramean traditions beyond their own people, shaping the languages, religions, and identities of the ancient Near East in ways that would echo for centuries. By the time the Persian kings ruled the Near East, Aramaic was no longer simply the tongue of a single people, but the shared medium of communication across one of the largest empires the world had yet seen. The journey from tribal dialect to imperial lingua franca had been long, shaped by centuries of migration, settlement, conquest, and adaptation. Yet it was under the Neo-Babylonian, and especially the Achaemenid Persian empires, that Aramaic achieved its widest reach, spreading far beyond the homelands of the Arameans and embedding itself into the daily life, administration, and culture of diverse populations. Its spread was not merely a story of language, but of cultural resilience, showing how a people whose kingdoms had been dismantled still shaped the destiny of an entire region. The practical advantages of Aramaic explain much of its success. Unlike Akkadian, with its complex cuneiform script of hundreds of signs, Aramaic was written with an alphabet of fewer than 30 characters. This made it easier to learn, quicker to write, and adaptable to different contexts. Written with ink on papyrus, parchment, or potsherds, it was portable in ways that clay tablets were not. Merchants could carry contracts with them, scribes could write quickly in the field, and officials could issue correspondence across vast distances without the burden of highly trained specialists. In an empire that stretched from Egypt to the Indus, efficiency in communication was essential, and Aramaic provided it. The Persians institutionalized this advantage. From the reign of Darius the Royal onward, Imperial Aramaic became the official administrative language of the empire. Decrees, letters, and records were issued in Aramaic, and scribes trained in its use were stationed across the provinces. The famous Behistun inscription of Darius, while composed in Old Persian, Elamite, and Akkadian on the monumental rock face, was accompanied by Aramaic versions for practical use in administration. In Egypt, Aramaic papyri from Elephantine preserved not only military correspondence, but also private contracts, marriage documents, and petitions, demonstrating how deeply the language permeated daily life. From Bactria in Central Asia to the Nile Valley, Aramaic inscriptions attest to its role as the glue binding the empire together. The spread of Aramaic was not confined to official administration. Trade networks carried it into markets and caravan routes where merchants from different lands needed a common tongue. Aramaic became the language of commerce as much as of government, facilitating exchanges between Greeks, Persians, Egyptians, Jews, Phoenicians, and Arabs. Its simple script lent itself to adaptation, giving rise to local variants that blended with indigenous traditions. Nabatean Aramaic in Arabia, Palmyrene Aramaic in Syria, and Syriac in Mesopotamia all developed from this broad diffusion, illustrating how the language took root in different soils while retaining its recognizable core. Religion also played a role in its dissemination. Jewish communities exiled in Babylon and later scattered across the Persian Empire adopted Aramaic as their spoken tongue. Parts of the Hebrew Bible, including sections of Daniel and Ezra, were written in Aramaic, reflecting this linguistic shift. The Targums, translations of Hebrew scriptures into Aramaic, ensured that the language became central to Jewish religious life for centuries. Later, Aramaic would become the language of Christian liturgy in the East, remembered as the tongue spoken by Jesus and his earliest followers. In this way, Aramaic's reach extended not only across empires, but into the foundations of world religions. The resilience of Aramaic in diverse contexts speaks to its adaptability. It could serve the needs of imperial administrators, merchants, priests, and commoners alike. It could coexist with older languages, such as Akkadian in Mesopotamia, or replace them over time. It could blend with Greek after the conquests of Alexander, giving rise to hybrid forms in Hellenistic cities. Wherever it went, it adapted without losing its essence, a quality that ensured its survival even as political powers rose and fell. Archaeological discoveries underscore the breadth of its spread. In Bactria, Aramaic inscriptions on leather documents show its use at the far eastern edge of the Persian world. In Egypt, hundreds of papyri written in Aramaic record the contracts and petitions of soldiers and civilians. In Anatolia, inscriptions carved into stone testify to its use in local administration. Even in Greece, Aramaic names and words appear, showing that the language had penetrated Mediterranean contexts. The ubiquity of these traces reveals how thoroughly Aramaic had become embedded in the life of the Near East. The survival of Aramaic beyond the fall of the Persian Empire further demonstrates its strength. When Alexander the Great conquered the Near East in the late 4th century BCE, Greek became the official language of administration under the Seleucid rulers who succeeded him. Yet Aramaic did not disappear. Instead, it coexisted with Greek, persisting as the spoken language of ordinary people and as the script of local traditions. In some regions, Greek dominated the elite sphere, while Aramaic remained the medium of popular culture and religion. This duality ensured that Aramaic continued to shape the identity of communities, even under Hellenistic and later Roman rule. The spread of Aramaic also had profound cultural consequences. Local dialects of Aramaic gave rise to literary traditions, from Nabatean inscriptions in Petra to Palmyrene texts in the Syrian desert. Syriac, a later dialect that developed in Mesopotamia, became the vehicle for a vast Christian literature, including translations of the Bible, theological works, and liturgical hymns. These traditions illustrate how the language, once associated with nomadic tribes, became a medium for some of the most influential religious and cultural expressions of antiquity. In political terms, the diffusion of Aramaic reflects the paradox of the Aramean experience. Their kingdoms were dismantled, their rulers overthrown, their populations deported, yet their language spread farther and lasted longer than those of their conquerors. Akkadian, the proud tongue of Assyrian kings, faded into oblivion. Old Persian, the language of Darius and Xerxes, left only monumental inscriptions. But Aramaic endured, carried by communities, merchants, and scribes, long after the empires that had adopted it had disappeared. This endurance testifies to the strength of cultural identity expressed not through armies and fortresses, but through words and writing. The spread of Aramaic across the Near East thus represents both continuity and transformation. It continued to serve as the language of ordinary Aramean communities, preserving their identity across centuries of political subjugation. At the same time, it transformed into something larger, a shared medium that connected diverse peoples across vast distances. It was no longer simply the language of the Arameans, but of the Near East itself, transcending its origins while preserving its roots. And as the language carried forward their legacy, so too did their religious and mythological traditions, which mingled with those of neighbouring peoples, and left their mark on the cultural and spiritual life of the region. The next part of the story turns to this dimension, exploring how the Arameans influenced religion, myth, and even the earliest layers of biblical tradition, ensuring that their voice was heard not only in trade and administration, but in the sacred narratives that shaped civilizations. The Arameans, though politically subdued by the Assyrians, Babylonians, and Persians, left deep imprints upon the religious and mythological traditions of the Near East. Their influence was not confined to the boundaries of their former kingdoms, but extended into the realms of myth, ritual, and scripture, shaping the sacred landscapes of peoples around them. The persistence of their language meant that their religious vocabulary and imagery travelled widely, embedding themselves in stories and texts that came to define the spiritual life of later generations. In exploring their impact, one must look not only at their own pantheon and cults, but at how their traditions resonated in Israelite religion, in biblical writings, and in the mythologies of neighbouring cultures. At the centre of Aramean religious life stood Hadad, the storm god, lord of thunder, rain, and fertility. Represented often as a bearded warrior wielding thunderbolts and standing upon a bull, Hadad embodied the agricultural cycles that sustained life in Syria and the Levant. His role as giver of rain was vital in a land where harvest depended on seasonal storms. Temples dedicated to him, such as those in Damascus and Aleppo, were not only places of worship but symbols of political legitimacy. For kings presented themselves as sons or servants of Hadad. The title Ben-Hadad, borne by several rulers of Damascus, reflects the intertwining of divine and royal authority. This conception of kingship under divine patronage parallels patterns in neighbouring cultures, yet Hadad's prominence in Aramean life ensured that his cult radiated outward, influencing others. Aramean religious vocabulary seeped into Hebrew traditions. The biblical polemics against Baal, for example, often mirror characteristics associated with Hadad. While the Canaanite Baal had long been venerated in the Levant, the proximity of Damascus and its cult of Hadad reinforced the perception of storm god worship as a powerful alternative to the Israelite devotion to Yahweh. Prophets such as Elijah and Elisha, who confronted the influence of Baal in Israel, lived during a time when Aramean kings were strong and their deities loomed large across the border. Thus, the opposition to Baal in the Hebrew Bible reflects not only Canaanite influences, but also the religious reality of Aramean power. Other Aramean deities also found echoes in biblical texts. The moon god Sin, prominent in Haran and other northern Aramean centres, left traces in narratives that associate the patriarchal ancestors with Haran. In Genesis, Abraham's family is said to have come from Aram Naharaim, the region of the two rivers, and his relatives are portrayed as dwelling in Haran. This tradition reflects real cultural memory of Aramean connections, linking Israel's own origin stories with the broader Aramean milieu. The figure of Laban, who dwelt in Aram and was called the Aramean, exemplifies this connection, serving as both kin and rival in the ancestral narratives. The phrase, "A wandering Aramean was my father," preserved in Deuteronomy as part of a ritual declaration, further embeds Aramean identity into the liturgy of Israel, showing how deeply intertwined their stories had become. The influence of Aramaic language on biblical literature also carried religious implications. As portions of the Hebrew Bible were composed or redacted during and after the exile, when Aramaic was the lingua franca, the presence of Aramaic words and sections reflects the lived reality of Jewish communities immersed in Aramean culture. The books of Daniel and Ezra, written in both Hebrew and Aramaic, symbolize this bilingual world, where religious expression flowed naturally between the two tongues. Aramaic prayers, blessings and formulas entered Jewish tradition, carrying with them echoes of older Aramean ritual speech. Aramean mythological motifs also travelled through shared cultural channels. Stories of divine conflict, fertility cycles, and the struggle between order and chaos appear in both Aramean and Israelite contexts, shaped by a common Semitic heritage but inflected by local traditions. The imagery of the storm god battling the sea or subduing cosmic forces resonates with biblical passages that describe Yahweh's victory over the waters or his mastery of the storm. These parallels do not imply direct borrowing in every case, but reveal a shared symbolic vocabulary across the Levant, within which the Arameans were active contributors. The Tel Dan Stele provides another glimpse of the Aramean religious worldview. Though primarily a political monument celebrating victories of an Aramean king, it invokes divine sanction for military success, linking conquest with the favour of the gods. This intertwining of religion and politics mirrors the biblical portrayal of Israel's own history, where victories and defeats are understood as reflections of divine will. The similarity of perspectives underscores the shared religious culture of the region, even as each people articulated it in their own idiom. The Arameans also influenced ritual practices that crossed boundaries. Sacrifices of animals, libations of wine, and the dedication of votive offerings were common throughout the Near East, but the spread of Aramaic as a language helped to carry the formulas and expressions associated with such rites. Inscriptions in Aramaic reveal vows made to deities, promises fulfilled with offerings, and prayers for protection. These formulas found resonance in neighbouring cultures, shaping the ways in which ritual speech was articulated. Over time, as Aramaic became the medium of prayer and scripture in Jewish and Christian traditions, the cadence of Aramean ritual language continued to echo in new religious settings. Myth and religion are never static, and the Arameans' openness to fusion with local traditions facilitated the transmission of their influence. Their gods could be identified with those of other cultures, Hadad with Baal or Adad, Sin with Mesopotamian counterparts, Ishtar-like goddesses with Astarte. This syncretism meant that Aramean religious elements were easily absorbed into wider mythological frameworks, making it difficult to draw hard lines between their traditions and those of their neighbours. Yet it also ensured that their influence extended far, woven into the fabric of Near Eastern religion, in ways that cannot be untangled without recognising their contribution. The survival of Aramean religious influence into later periods further illustrates their impact. In the Hellenistic and Roman eras, local cults in Syria and Mesopotamia preserved elements of Aramean worship, often under new names or in new forms. Palmyra, for example, venerated gods with Semitic roots expressed in Aramaic inscriptions, blending older traditions with Greco-Roman forms. In Haran, the cult of the moon god Sin persisted well into late antiquity, remembered in Islamic sources centuries later. These continuities reveal that the religious world shaped by the Arameans did not vanish with their kingdoms, but endured in transformed guises. Perhaps most enduring of all was the association of Aramaic with the sacred. When Jesus spoke in Galilee in the 1st century CE, he used an Aramaic dialect, linking the everyday language of the region with the words remembered as divine teaching. The prayers preserved in Aramaic, such as the familiar Abba for Father, connect directly back to the linguistic and cultural heritage of the Arameans. In Christian liturgy, Syriac, an Aramaic dialect, became one of the great vehicles of theology and hymnody. Thus, the religious influence of the Arameans extended not only into Judaism but into Christianity, shaping two of the world's major religions. In tracing their influence, one sees again the paradox of Aramean history, politically conquered, yet spiritually and culturally victorious. Their gods and myths informed those of others, their ritual language entered scripture, and their tongue became the medium of prayer and prophecy. The storm god of Damascus, the moon god of Haran, the ritual formulas inscribed in Aramaic, all found echoes in texts and traditions that survived long after Aramean kings were forgotten. And as their religious and mythological presence spread, so too did their communities, scattered by conquest yet persistent as diaspora groups across Mesopotamia, Egypt and beyond. The next part of the story moves naturally into this transformation, examining how the Arameans shifted from tribal confederations and kingdoms into dispersed communities whose survival depended less on territory than on identity carried through language, religion and memory. The transformation of the Arameans from loosely organised tribal groups into urbanised kingdoms had defined the early centuries of their history. Yet just as significant was the next transformation, one that occurred under the weight of conquest and empire. Their shift from rulers of their own polities to dispersed communities scattered across the vast territories of Mesopotamia, the Levant, Egypt, and beyond. This transition from tribal confederations to diaspora populations was not an abrupt change, but a gradual process, shaped by deportations, migrations, trade, and adaptation. It was through this process that the Arameans endured, long after their kingdoms had disappeared, by becoming a people whose identity was carried not in kings or fortresses, but in communities, traditions, and above all their language. In their earliest days, Aramean organisation had revolved around the tribe, bound by kinship, oaths, and the authority of chiefs. Mobility was essential, as pastoral life required constant movement in search of grazing lands and water. Raids, alliances, and shifting loyalties characterised their interactions with neighbours. These confederations were fluid, expanding or contracting as circumstances dictated. When they began to settle, the tribes coalesced into kingdoms, with fortified cities and dynasties replacing tents and chieftains. But this phase of political development, which had given rise to states like Damascus and Bitagusi, proved fragile under the relentless advance of Assyria. The conquest of their cities and the deportation of their populations marked the end of their political independence, but not the end of their story. Assyrian policy played a central role in dispersing Aramean populations. From the reign of Tiglath-Pileser III onward, entire communities were uprooted and resettled far from their homelands. Deportations were not random acts of cruelty, but deliberate strategies of empire, designed to weaken resistance by breaking local power structures and repopulating strategic regions with loyal subjects. For the Arameans, this meant that large numbers were transplanted to Assyria, Babylonia, and other provinces. In these new settings, they retained elements of their identity, speaking their language, practicing their religion, and maintaining communal ties, even as they adapted to new surroundings. Aramaic's rise as the lingua franca of the Near East ensured that these dispersed communities remained connected. A merchant in Babylon, a soldier in Egypt, and a farmer in the Assyrian heartland could all communicate in Aramaic, sustaining a sense of shared culture despite distance. Unlike other deported peoples whose languages faded in exile, the Arameans found that their speech became increasingly useful in imperial contexts. This linguistic continuity was the backbone of their diasporic identity, allowing them to preserve cultural cohesion while also integrating into broader societies. Aramean communities also thrived in economic roles that spanned empires. Many became merchants, facilitating trade along caravan routes and within cities. Others served as scribes, soldiers, or craftsmen, professions that allowed them to interact with imperial elites while maintaining communal distinctiveness. In Egypt, the colony at Elephantine illustrates how Aramean and Jewish mercenaries established a thriving community under Persian rule, complete with temples, contracts, and familial records written in Aramaic. The papyri from this settlement provide rare insight into how diasporic communities functioned. They were at once loyal to imperial authorities, integrated into local economies, and yet self-consciously distinct, preserving their traditions in foreign lands. The persistence of religious practices among these communities also reveals the endurance of identity. Temples dedicated to deities like Hadad or Sin continued to exist, sometimes syncretized with local cults. Household shrines preserved older traditions, even when imperial or local gods dominated public spaces. Ritual language in Aramaic carried prayers and invocations that maintained continuity with ancestral faiths. This blending of persistence and adaptation was characteristic of diaspora life. The Arameans did not live in isolation but absorbed elements of the cultures around them while holding on to enough of their own to remain recognizable. Over time, the memory of independent kingdoms faded, replaced by the reality of diaspora existence. The identity of an Aramean no longer depended on loyalty to Damascus, Arpad, or Hamath, but on membership in a dispersed community united by language, traditions, and shared ancestry. This transformation was both a loss and a gain. It meant the end of political sovereignty, but it also meant the beginning of a more flexible and enduring identity, one that could survive without borders and adapt to shifting political realities. The Israelites provide an illuminating parallel. Like the Arameans, they experienced deportation, exile, and the loss of political independence. Their survival depended on their ability to preserve identity in diaspora through language, religion, and communal cohesion. In some cases, the two groups even shared the same spaces, such as in Babylon or Egypt, influencing one another in the process. This shared experience of exile created a cultural milieu in which Aramean and Israelite traditions intertwined, leaving lasting marks on scripture and practice. By the Persian period, Aramean diaspora communities were so widespread that they had become integral to the fabric of the empire. Their language was used in administration, their merchants connected distant markets, and their scribes staffed imperial offices. In this sense, their diaspora was not one of marginalization, but of embeddedness, where they contributed actively to the functioning of empire while maintaining distinct identity. This dual role gave them a kind of soft power, allowing their influence to persist long after their kingdoms were gone. The transformation into a diaspora people also laid the groundwork for their later roles in the Hellenistic and Roman periods. As Greek replaced Aramaic in some official contexts, and as Roman power extended into the Near East, Aramean communities adapted once again. Syriac, a dialect of Aramaic, emerged as a major literary and liturgical language, ensuring that the traditions of the Arameans continue to flourish in new forms. The resilience they had shown in adapting to Assyrian and Persian domination now enabled them to thrive under new powers, carrying forward their identity into yet another era. The story of the Arameans thus illustrates how identity can survive without political sovereignty. From tribes bound by kinship to kingdoms fortified by walls, to communities scattered across empires, they remained a people. The loss of independence did not erase them but transformed them, making them more diffuse, more adaptable, and ultimately more enduring. Their diaspora identity was rooted in language, sustained by religion, and expressed in community life, allowing them to persist in ways that kingdoms alone could not have guaranteed. and as these communities endured across the centuries, they became part of the changing political landscapes of the Hellenistic and Roman periods, where their language, traditions and roles evolved once again, shaping and being shaped by the new powers that rose to dominate the Near East. By the time Alexander of Macedon swept across the Near East in the late 4th century before the Common Era, the Arameans no longer existed as rulers of kingdoms or commanders of armies. Their independent states had long since fallen to Assyrian power, their cities transformed into provincial centres, and their populations dispersed across Mesopotamia and beyond. Yet Alexander and his successors encountered a Near East still deeply marked by the Aramean presence, for their language and traditions had not disappeared. Instead, they had become the cultural fabric of the region, woven into trade, religion, and daily life. The Hellenistic and Roman eras would see new transformations, in which the Arameans as a distinct political entity faded into obscurity, while their linguistic and cultural legacy persisted and even flourished in unexpected ways. The conquests of Alexander brought Greek language and culture to the forefront of the Near East. Greek became the official tongue of administration, philosophy, and high culture under the Seleucid Empire, one of the successor states that emerged after Alexander's death. Cities were founded or refounded as centres of Hellenistic culture, such as Antioch in Syria, which became a major metropolis. The new rulers promoted Greek civic institutions, coinage, and artistic styles. Yet beneath this veneer of Hellenization, Aramaic remained the language of the common people. Farmers, traders, and villagers across Syria, Mesopotamia, and Palestine continued to speak it in their homes and markets. Greek dominated the courts and academies, but Aramaic dominated the streets. This coexistence of languages created a dual identity for many communities. Elite circles adopted Greek education and participated in Hellenistic cultural life, while the majority retained Aramaic as their spoken tongue. In some cases, the two languages blended, with Greek words entering Aramaic speech and Aramaic influences visible in local dialects of Greek. Inscriptions from this period often appear bilingual, with official decrees in Greek and local dedications in Aramaic. This bilingualism illustrates the persistence of Aramean cultural identity, even in a world increasingly shaped by Greek forms. Religious life reflected the same blend. Temples to Greek gods stood alongside shrines dedicated to Semitic deities. In Palmyra, the great caravan city of the Syrian desert, inscriptions reveal the veneration of gods with Semitic roots, expressed in Aramaic, while Greek artistic styles adorned their temples. Palmyrene Aramaic developed as a distinct dialect, used in inscriptions and everyday life, showing how local communities adapted to new political realities without abandoning their linguistic heritage. The same was true in Nabatea, where Aramaic inscriptions in Petra demonstrate the continuity of the language alongside increasing Hellenistic influence. The Seleucid rulers, though committed to Greek culture, relied on Aramaic for practical governance in many areas. The reach of Greek could not fully displace the entrenched role of Aramaic as a lingua franca. Contracts, letters, and local administration often continued in Aramaic, especially outside the great Hellenistic cities. This persistence underscores the adaptability of Aramean identity. Though politically powerless, they remained culturally indispensable. Under Roman rule, which followed the conquest of Syria in the 1st century BCE, the same pattern persisted. Latin never replaced Greek in the eastern provinces, and Greek never displaced Aramaic among the common people. Roman governors issued edicts in Greek, but peasants in villages from the Euphrates to Galilee continued to speak Aramaic. The Roman Empire, vast and diverse, tolerated such linguistic pluralism, and Aramaic communities flourished within it. In fact, some of the most significant religious developments of the Roman period took place in Aramaic-speaking contexts. The emergence of Christianity in the 1st century CE is perhaps the most striking example. Jesus of Nazareth spoke an Aramaic dialect, and many of his sayings preserved in the Gospels retain their original Aramaic form. Phrases like Talitha Koum or Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani. The earliest followers of Jesus lived in Aramaic-speaking communities of Galilee and Judea, even as the New Testament was written in Greek. The underlying world in which it emerged was one where Aramaic was the language of daily life, prayer, and teaching. Christianity, which would become a global religion, was born in the linguistic and cultural matrix of the Arameans. In the centuries that followed, Syriac, a dialect of Aramaic that developed in Mesopotamia, became one of the great literary languages of Christianity. Syriac translations of the Bible, theological treatises, and hymns flourished, creating a body of literature that rivaled Greek and Latin traditions. Centres of learning in Edessa and Nisibis produced scholars, poets, and theologians who shaped the intellectual life of the Christian East. Syriac Christianity preserved the Aramaic heritage long after the Arameans themselves had ceased to exist as a distinct political or ethnic group. The role of Aramaic in Jewish life also remained significant. After the Babylonian exile, Jewish communities had adopted Aramaic as their daily language. By the Roman period, it was the tongue of most Jews in Palestine and Babylonia. The Targums, translations of the Hebrew Bible into Aramaic, ensured that scripture remained accessible to ordinary people. Rabbinic discussions recorded in the Talmud were preserved in Aramaic, embedding the language at the heart of Jewish religious tradition. Thus, two of the world's great religions carried forward the Aramean linguistic legacy, even as the people themselves blended into broader Near Eastern populations. Diaspora communities continued to thrive in the Hellenistic and Roman periods. In Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Syria, Arameans, or those descended from them, integrated into local societies while retaining elements of their heritage. Merchants from Palmyra carved out a prominent role in long-distance trade, linking the Roman Empire with Persia and beyond. Their inscriptions, written in Palmyrene Aramaic, testify to their continued use of the language in both commercial and religious life. The wealth of Palmyra, derived from its caravan trade, demonstrates how diaspora communities could flourish under Roman protection while maintaining a sense of distinct identity. Even in decline, their religious traditions endured. The moon cult of Haran persisted into late antiquity, remembered in Greek and Arabic sources alike. Local variations of storm god worship continued, often syncretized with Greco-Roman deities. Household shrines and rural sanctuaries maintained older forms of devotion, blending them with new cultural influences. This persistence shows how deeply rooted Aramean traditions were, surviving long after their political structures had vanished. The Hellenistic and Roman eras also saw the rise of written Aramaic dialects that would shape later centuries. Nabatean script evolved into Arabic script, linking the Aramean linguistic heritage with the development of a New World language. Syriac provided the foundation for Christian liturgy and theology across Asia. Palmyrene inscriptions offer a snapshot of cultural identity in a cosmopolitan city at the crossroads of empires. These dialects illustrate how Aramaic adapted to new contexts while preserving its essence, ensuring its influence long after the Arameans themselves had been forgotten as a people. The persistence of their language and traditions in this period underscores a central theme of their history. Political defeat did not mean cultural disappearance. On the contrary, their influence spread more widely than ever, carried by merchants, priests, and scholars across the Mediterranean and the Near East. Even as Greek and Latin dominated imperial elites, Aramaic continued to shape the lives of millions, providing continuity in a world of constant change. The Arameans in the Hellenistic and Roman periods were thus no longer a nation in the political sense, but a people whose heritage lived on in language, religion, and culture. Their transformation into communities integrated into larger empires did not erase their identity, but gave it new forms. The kings of Damascus and Hamath were long gone, but the words spoken in markets, the prayers uttered in temples and synagogues, and the scriptures read in churches carried forward the legacy of the Arameans, and as these traditions endured, they laid the foundation for the final stage of the story, in which the memory of the Arameans merged into the broader legacy of their language and culture, leaving behind a heritage that would continue to echo through the Near East and beyond long after the name of their people had faded from political maps. The kingdoms of the Arameans had long since vanished from the political map by the dawn of late antiquity. Their fortified cities lay in ruins or had been absorbed into the structures of empires, their dynasties extinguished or replaced by governors sent from distant capitals. Yet the disappearance of their states did not mean the disappearance of their influence. On the contrary, the legacy of the Arameans survived in ways more profound than any fortress or throne could have ensured. Their greatest inheritance to the world was their language, which became one of the most enduring cultural forces of the ancient Near East, outlasting the empires that conquered them and continuing to shape religions, cultures and identities long after their own political independence was gone. Aramaic had begun as the speech of nomadic tribes, carried in camps and across pastures, passed orally from one generation to another. Its alphabetic script, simple and efficient, allowed it to expand beyond spoken word into writing that could travel and endure. It was this adaptability that enabled it to spread when the Assyrians deported Aramean populations across Mesopotamia, when the Babylonians absorbed them into their cities, and when the Persians institutionalized it as the language of imperial administration. From Egypt to Bactria, from Anatolia to Mesopotamia, Aramaic became the thread that tied together an empire of diverse tongues. Even when Greek and later Latin became the languages of elites, Aramaic remained the language of markets, villages, synagogues and churches, spoken by millions and shaping the daily rhythms of life across the Near East. Its influence on religion ensured its survival in ways no army could have achieved. Among Jewish communities, Aramaic became the language of everyday life after the Babylonian exile. Portions of scripture were written in it, and translations of Hebrew texts into Aramaic, the Targums, ensured that sacred writings could be understood by people whose mother tongue was no longer Hebrew. Rabbinic debates and legal rulings were preserved in Aramaic in the Talmud, embedding the language deeply into Jewish religious tradition. It was in Aramaic that prayers were spoken in homes and synagogues across Babylonia, Syria and Palestine, binding scattered communities together through shared words. For Christians, Aramaic carried even greater resonance, for it was the language spoken by Jesus of Nazareth and his earliest followers. The words remembered from his teaching, phrases like Abba, Talitha Kum, or Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, are preserved in the Gospels in their Aramaic form, echoing across centuries as fragments of the living speech of first-century Galilee. Early Christianity spread in Aramaic-speaking communities, and Syriac, a dialect of Aramaic, became one of the great literary languages of Christian tradition. The Syriac Bible, the Peshitta, provided scripture in the mother tongue of countless believers, while theologians and poets composed hymns, homilies, and treatises in the same language. Monasteries from Edessa to Nisibis carried Syriac Christianity into Persia, India, and even China, extending the reach of the Aramean legacy far beyond its original homelands. Aramaic also shaped Islam in indirect but significant ways. The Quran, though composed in Arabic, reflects an environment where Aramaic was still widely spoken, and where Christian and Jewish communities used it in liturgy and scripture. Scholars have long noted parallels between Quranic vocabulary and Aramaic expressions, showing how deeply the language had permeated the religious and cultural life of the region. Even as Arabic rose to dominance, it absorbed elements from Aramaic, carrying forward the traces of its influence. The endurance of Aramaic in local communities is equally striking. In the mountains of Syria, Mesopotamia and eastern Anatolia, dialects of Aramaic continue to be spoken into the medieval period and survive even today among small communities. These modern dialects, often called Neo-Aramaic, represent the last living descendants of the ancient tongue that once united the Near East. Their persistence, despite centuries of political upheaval, conquest and cultural assimilation, is a testament to the resilience of language as a vessel of identity. Through them, the voice of the ancient Arameans can still be heard, carried on in prayer and conversation across millennia. The legacy of the Arameans is also preserved in the scripts and alphabets derived from their writing system. The Nabatean script, a variant of Aramaic, evolved into the Arabic script that is used today by millions across the Middle East and beyond. Hebrew script, too, was influenced by Aramaic forms, shaping the letters still used in Jewish liturgy and study. Syriac script developed into its own elegant forms, used not only for religious texts, but also for scientific and philosophical works, translated into Syriac during the late antique period. In this way, the alphabet that once served nomadic herders became the foundation of some of the world's most important scripts, carrying the legacy of the Arameans into entirely new civilizations. The memory of the Arameans themselves, however, became diffuse. As their language and traditions spread, their name gradually faded, absorbed into the identities of larger religious and cultural groups. They were remembered in biblical texts as rivals and kin of Israel, in Assyrian inscriptions as stubborn enemies, in local cults as worshippers of Hadad and Sin. Yet as centuries passed, they ceased to exist as a distinct political entity. Their survival lay not in the continuity of their name, but in the endurance of their contributions. The paradox of their history is that while the Aramean kingdoms disappeared, their cultural inheritance outlived not only their conquerors, but also many of the peoples with whom they had once contended. Archaeology provides glimpses of their enduring presence. Inscriptions in Aramaic from Palmyra, Petra, and Edessa testify to the vitality of the language well into the Roman period. The Elephantine papyri from Egypt preserve Aramaic documents written by diaspora communities under Persian rule. The manuscripts of Qumran, among the Dead Sea Scrolls, include texts in Aramaic, revealing its role in Jewish religious life. Syriac manuscripts from late antiquity and the early medieval period show the flourishing of Aramaic literary culture in Christianity. These written traces, scattered across regions and centuries, form a mosaic of continuity, each piece preserving part of the legacy of a people who no longer existed as a state, but who endured through words. The enduring legacy of the Arameans lies also in the model they provide of cultural survival without political sovereignty. They show how a people can lose their cities, their kings, and their armies, yet remain influential through language, religion, and adaptation. Their history challenges assumptions that conquest always means disappearance. Instead, it demonstrates that resilience can take the form of diffusion, that identity can persist in new guises, and that cultural power can outlast political defeat. As the centuries unfolded, the world of the Arameans was reshaped by new empires, new religions, and new languages. Yet in the prayers spoken in synagogues and churches, in the alphabets used to write Hebrew, Arabic, and Syriac, and in the fragments of speech preserved in the Gospels, their voice remains audible. Theirs is a legacy not of monuments, but of words, not of kings, but of communities, not of conquest, but of endurance. And so the story of the Arameans comes into focus not as the tale of a people who vanished, but as the story of a culture that transformed and survived, carried forward by the strength of its language, embedded in the faiths and traditions of millions, and echoed even now in the living tongues of communities who trace their words back to the ancient herders of the Syrian steppe.